coming.
So,
It's called Delta what? What is it called?
Delta Graph.
Delta gut?
it's deadly like Delta and spreads like Omicron.
You got it.
Oh my God. Oh,
So,
vive la France.
so Rick,
Donald.
yes, at the very end of last week, you were talking about one of the flaws of rationality, in that it
Yes.
gets into these, it builds these systems that are ideological in nature, in that they have that characteristic that's commonly called they're not even false. That is, they're not falsifiable,
Right.
which is a common property of almost all modern systems, except maybe some by some experimental physicist or something. Political systems, philosophical systems, is generated by our rational modern selves,
Right.
become untethered. And I just wondered, that was really wrapped up with you saying goodbye. And I thought that was a very good point, and that you could resume a bit with that, because I think it is one of the keys of modernity.
Yes. There's a couple of things to go through this week. When Sharon had to leave early last week, I said, oh, we're going to cover Savonarola. And so you're going to miss it and you'll have to check the recording. But the truth is, I made a number of historical errors in my race to fit in the Savonarola discussion in the last few minutes. So I thought we would back up and tackle that again this week and do it right. Because there are relationships between Savonarola, Pico, and Joan of Arc, which are very illuminating for understanding the difference between medievalism and modernism. I feel like we shouldn't give short shrift to this particular complex of issues.
I was wondering, I might point out something. I was in a meeting with a few of the atheists, and the atheists were all telling me that Joan of Arc was simply a crazy. I was defending Joan of Arc and saying she was inspired to liberate the French from English oppression. But what's this right? Why do they think they have this right to say that Joan of Arc just out and out is a crazy?
That's the modern perspective.
Hmm?
That's the modern perspective. The modern perspective is anybody who doesn't make decisions in a rational way is crazy. Rationalism is the only sanity. And
French nationalism is crazy. So is English nationalism.
And they've transformed into modernist forms. There was a medieval French nationalism, a medieval English nationalism, and now there's a modern English nationalism and a modern French nationalism, and they don't entirely understand the transitions they've gone through. But by looking at Joan of Arc and the similarities and differences between her and Savonarola and Pico, I think we will get some very illuminating exploration of the boundary between the cases. So we'll take up what you're talking about, Stephen. We'll talk about.
Yeah, I think it's rather amazing that all these ironclad warriors respected the visions of a peasant girl, but
right.
This is history. This is the way it works.
Exactly. We make our tiny theories about how it's going to go, and then history does something out of left field that we were certain could not happen, but there it is happening. And we have a choice. We can either adjust our theories of history to be more encompassing, or we can declare it an anomaly and move on and not think about it.
I think it just comes down to the world is a big place. The universe is very, very, very big, as Douglas Adams tried to point out.
Yes.
And
yes,
we're trying to fit it in our small minds.
Exactly. Exactly. So I wanted to explore this, and I think Donald's right. We should also, as part of that, explore the Achilles heel of rationalism, this ability to produce valid, self-consistent, persuasive systems of thinking and organization that are neither false nor true, but not even falsifiable, because they make sense in their own terms, and in other terms that you couldn't even tell if it was right or wrong. It's in a third category. So we'll explore that too. Phil, you got your hand up too. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, my question is related to what Donald's question is. This last week, I heard a talk on Kant, which sort of modified my understanding of Kant.
Sure.
And he says that the Kantian concept of the transcendental is not the same as transcendent.
Right.
Transcendent is like something like God, some sort of spiritual whatever. And so he's not talking about that. He's talking about transcendental, which is apparently thinking about the structure of thinking itself. And if that's true, then in a sense, it does create something that is a little different than just thinking, in the sense that it's a category that is actually sort of like related, if not part of metaphysics, that it has its own logic. It transcends just merely experience, thinking about the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So the structure of itself. So he does seem to run into a kind of dead end that, yes, that there is this realm which is true and consistent, but it's just sort of, I would call it like a third in between zone that you could get to, and it is consistent.
Yes.
But it's not actually necessarily consistent with the concept of time and space. So that's kind of interesting, because he's sort of admitting the transcendental is part of the structure of the human mind, but not necessarily the structure of the world, which is sort of, okay, yeah, I could buy that. In fact, if I look at modern art in a way, it's sort of Kantian in the sense that, oh yes, it's about the form of the structure of the mind and how it could critique itself and transform itself, but not necessarily. And that's what the division, like I said, between Picasso and Cezanne is, right? Because they're both talking about the forms, but one is about the form of the structure of the mind versus. Remember, I never gave up on Picasso. I just sort of said,
Right.
oh, there's a real difference between that and Cezanne, and I recognize that, right? So in some sense, maybe we shouldn't be quite so harsh on Kant, because he actually doesn't say what you think he says, right? He actually is trying to say, yes, there is this thing about thinking, which is a second level of thinking.
Yeah.
Of course, unfortunately, somebody like well, the Dadaist, I shouldn't forget his name, but Duchamp said, oh no, there's a negation of that, because there's actually thinking about thinking, which
Yes.
is like, and I showed the example of when he says the door is either closed, open or closed, and he's constructed a door that's pinged on 3 rooms, that when you close the door to one room, it's open to the other room. So that is the not the exclusion of the middle. There's something that's open and closed at the same time. So in some sense, you could say modernity has like negated itself by opening up the fact, oh no, thinking about thinking is, okay, it is a higher level than maybe just thinking, but it's not the in all. So I thought that was very enlightening, because yeah, okay, it went through that, in some sense, that's kind of like a little bit like the postmodern.
Yeah.
In that sense, right?
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, basically, I mean, this is the thing is, taking diversions into other philosophers and exploring their perspectives is not a one-time experience. You have to do it the first time with all of your preconceptions you don't know you have, but later, as you shake up your understanding of the world, you come back and re-experience those philosophers, and you're going to read something different in them that you didn't see before. And of course, our challenge is we don't know what Kant's own perspective was from his experience, right? It's not possible because we're not Kant. So we're always kind of coming at him from different angles, trying to figure him out. And it's the same with any profound writer. So, I think with this, the goal with these philosophers isn't to sort them into good camps and bad camps, who's right and who's wrong. Although the history of science and philosophy are often taught that way, it's not productive. It's more important to look at, what was their perspective? Why did the world look the way that it did to them? And then if somebody else picks up their work and runs with it and takes it in a new direction, we don't see them as straight up refuting the previous philosopher, but as building upon them.
Well, I think Kant was actually, in a way, refuting Augustine, and he's recuperating the true Plato, right? Because Plato was thinking about the forms themselves too, but I'm not so sure if those forms are transcendental. I mean, transcendent, the transcendental. So, in some sense, maybe he is refuting the church in a sense, although he didn't give up on it totally. But maybe he's refuting the church interpretation, the Neoplatonists, in a sense, denigrating or transforming. I shouldn't say denigrate, transforming Plato's idea into this sort of super spiritual religious idea. So that's kind of interesting.
If you haven't read Ernst Cassirer yet, I think you sound like you're ready for him, because Cassirer is a 20th century Neoplatonist who tried to stand Plato on his feet from his perspective. Mm-hmm. He said, the ideal forms, it's to approach that Plato's ideal forms from the perspective of they either do exist or don't exist is missing the point. Whether they exist out here in the world isn't nearly as interesting a question as whether they exist in the human mind. Are Plato's forms, rather than a description of external objective reality, are they a description of the nature of the way that human beings conceive of things? Is it perhaps a really valuable tool for understanding the structure of understanding itself? You're talking about the meta level. So Cassirer's works, they're short. They're not big fat books. They're thin books. I think you'd enjoy them. Language and Myth, and the series, the 3-volume series that he did on symbolic forms on Plato. I think you'd really enjoy them, given what you're talking about here. So I'm just going to put his name in here as a reminder. Ernst Cassirer.
Oh, thanks.
So check him out, because he works right in that intersection you're talking about. And Kenneth Smith cites him from time to time. He's relevant to the discussion. But I want to take us back to the intersection of medievalism and modernism.
Yes.
Because there's a lot to learn about what modernity is by understanding what medievalism is with a level of clarity that we don't normally bring to it. So the first thing I have to clear up that I got wrong last week is that Leo X, the Pope, the Medici Pope, he wasn't till later. He was not contemporary with the people we're talking about. He was sort of the Medici's coming back and trying to regain power, and they doing it through the papacy. And the Medicis were not the cause of the corruption in the papacy, right? I sort of painted a simplistic picture last week, as though the Medicis were powerful and they saw the papacy as a way to gain power, and so of course they corrupted the papacy in order to gain more power. Mm-hmm. But that's grossly oversimplified. All of these popes, including the non-Medici popes in this era, were corrupt. There was a Borgia pope. There were popes who didn't come from any of these noble families, but were just as corrupt as the rest. And we'll talk through a bit, but this is the era where people began saying that, for example, popes began saying that slavery would be fine as long as it wasn't white people. This is where you get the popes ruling on the doctrine of discovery, saying that if a Christian power discovers a non-Christian power, it's okay to claim everything they have and enslave everybody because, you know, it's good for their souls to be enslaved by a Christian. It'll lead them to God. Popes are saying this sort of thing one after another, and it doesn't matter whether they're a Borgia or a Medici or none of the above. This is this big rising movement. At the same time, the popes in this era, they're not just coming from one or two corrupt families. They're coming from all of the powerful families of Europe, which means they've got their hands dirty in all the dynastic intrigue between kings and emperors. They're constantly taking sides. They're constantly excommunicating the other side's group, you know, king or their country. They're constantly using the what are supposed to be the sacred powers of their office for what are obviously secular ends. There's no one pope who is responsible for this mess, and there's no one family who's responsible for this mess. It's just, you know, we'll talk about a few of them so that we can give you some clear examples. But I wanted to straighten that out a little bit. The other thing is that Savonarola died later, even though there are some very interesting relationships between the death of Savonarola and the death of Pico. And Poliziano. Pico and Poliziano died about the same time, and that was about 2 years before Savonarola. It was one group that did in Pico and Poliziano. It was another group, a specific pope and his supporters, who did in Savonarola. So we'll talk about them, but they're intricately related. They're intricately related. Stephen asked, do we believe Martin Luther's position? You mean with regard to whether Savonarola was a predecessor?
No, the church had been dealing with a lot of heretics over the hundreds of years. How did they manage to let that one get through?
Right.
This big, fat, boorish German, how did he manage to do it? I'm amazed to this day.
Well, the stage in history at which the powers that be clamped down with the complete awesome might of their office, the culmination of their epoch. It's not like previous clampdowns. That's about the end. So to give you an example, Pico's 900 Theses was the first book officially banned by the church.
Yes.
For 1,000 years, they hadn't done that.
China's trade surplus just.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, was that you, Phil?
Oh yeah, no, I had to turn off something. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I should turn off the mic first.
Moderns like to paint the medieval period as the Dark Age, and they like to dump all of their sins into the Dark Age and sort of smear it across the entire length of it and say this entire age was one thing, and that one thing was bad from beginning to end. It was corrupt from beginning to end. There were witch burnings from beginning to end. There were book bannings from beginning to end. They want to create a cartoon version of 1,000 years of complex history. And as moderns, we internalize an enormous amount of that caricature without ever realizing it. Even people who study history, even people who study medieval history, will be better at the period that they study and not at the other parts of the medieval history, which will default to the cartoon modernist perspective because it's so appealing to us. We arose out of darkness, from ignorance and superstition to the Enlightenment, noble us, right? There's this huge egotistical payoff in the modernist story of history. And so one finds oneself slipping into it left and right. So it's important to understand, you know, here we are in the late 1400s, and Pico della Mirandola's 900 Theses is the first book ever banned by the church, which tells us that book bannings were not part of the medieval era. Now, that's not to say information wasn't suppressed. It was, but in different ways. Monks were copying the classics, but they chose not to copy the ones they didn't like Aristotle's comedy. She didn't think was respectable enough for the philosopher that they were hinging their hopes on. So they just left that one out, you know, or they would interpolate, right? They would insert things and they would cut things, and, you know, all that stuff would happen during the process of copying. But the thing to understand is that was not anything like a Stalinist purge or, you know, any other kind of modern censorship, because again, the theme is in the medieval era, they did not have industrialized control over anything, including the passage of information. What you get instead is the convergence of thousands upon thousands of individual acts who share a belief system, but otherwise are individuals. And whether this monk copies a certain phrase or in another monk chooses not to, has less to do with the orthodoxy of the church and more to do with their own personal experience of what they imagine to be, right and wrong and truth and so forth. There is an enormous variety of experience in the medieval era at exactly the same time that the top of the hierarchy wants to impose, a totalitarian regime in which everybody believes exactly the same thing. They utterly can't do it and don't do it. Instead, you get this explosion of diversity. One of the things that we're going to hit today is that we talked a few weeks ago about the rise of the Orthodox sect within Christianity prior to the medieval era as setting it up, and that they saw their job as a kind of whack-a-mole job, because there were all these other Christian sects who had different beliefs, like the ones who thought we should do what Jesus said. That was not part of the orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy was constantly plagued coming out of the gate by all of these people who would say, well, Jesus did say we should love one another. Maybe we should get on with that sort of thing. Maybe we shouldn't ignore him. There'd be the Orthodox saying, yeah, but don't take it too far or else we're going to come, crusade on you. So the thing is, this whack-a-mole with heresies, I mentioned before that it was both successful enough that they could capture the Roman Empire and use its might to create the organized church that rolls out into the medieval era, but they were also unsuccessful enough that literally coming out of the gate as part of the medieval revolution, it was them and 17 other heresies all simultaneously side by side, racing along, all saying we all believe the same thing, even though they absolutely didn't. So one of the things we're going to emphasize this week is that was true at the end of the era as well. What you're going to see with Joan of Arc, with Pico, with Savonarola and others, is that it is intrinsic and essential to the medieval worldview that these heresies keep erupting. There was no way, however much the Banausic corrupt structure of the hierarchy might have wanted to impose an orthodoxy, it was not only impossible to impose it, it was necessary that these heresies keep fountaining and flourishing. It was built right into the cultural DNA of how they saw the world and their relationship to God. There was no way around it. And that's why there's a line that goes from Joan of Arc to the Pico della Mirandola to Savonarola and into the modern era of people seeing God and understanding God their own way. And you can trace it all the way back to Paul and maybe to Jesus himself, with the idea that you could have a direct connection to the spiritual, and that what you saw and understood through that direct connection was more important than what the secular or even church authorities had to tell you. The idea of bucking the authorities is built right into the gospel. I mean, Jesus goes after the temple. He goes after hypocrites and corruption, right? It's like a central part of his message. So it's not surprising that here we are in 1492, and we've still got people coming out of nowhere going, hey, the church is corrupt. The officials have drifted from God, and we must get back to the true path. All right, Sharon, then Stephen, then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
A couple of things. Savonarola seemed to have impacted Pico's life in two different times. Mm-hmm. One, when he was just being educated.
Yes.
And the second time, after he had written the thesis and he was in trouble and he was dealing with the Medicis.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I want you to comment on what had happened between that time. How had Savonarola changed? We know Pico had changed because he wrote the 900 Theses, but what influence did he bring to Pico's life at that time?
So a couple of things about this that are really interesting. Pico and Savonarola and Joan of Arc were all visionaries. And I don't mean it just like in a modern sense. I mean, they saw visions. They saw apocalyptic level visions. they thought they were seeing God's plan, and that they had a personal mandate to act, and that they had to act, that they were driven desperately to act. I'm going to put a link here to a paper that's really interesting on this subject. Here it is, Pico's Roman Debate. This is from the book Syncretism in the West, and it's well worth looking at. What this talks about is the way that evidently Pico, the reason that Pico wrote his 900 Theses and his oration on the dignity of man, which was an introduction to what he was going to do later, and the reason that he was sending out invitations to every great thinker, and the reason that he was researching all the great thinkers of the past and trying to pull it together into a master plan, is he believed that when people came to a great agreement about God, including the Jews who he thought he was going to convert, he thought there would be this, at the debate in Rome that he planned, he believed that all of Judaism would be persuaded by the logic of his argument and convert to Christianity. And that would bring about the second coming that would happen literally while they were standing there in Rome. And it would be the end of history. Jesus would come back. All the things foretold in Revelation and in the New Testament would come to pass. And it would be, God's kingdom from there on out. He believed in an apocalyptic interpretation of everything he had ever learned, and that it was all going to be tied up neatly.
Just to be clear, that didn't happen, right? I just wanted to double check.
Well, can I just say something to Joseph here? So, so I was making conversation with one of the guys in the clinic, and I said, "So, what did you get for Christmas?" And he said he got stuff for the rapture. So I said, "Oh, what did you get?" He said, "Oh, flashlights and stuff." So I said, "Well, if you're going to be taken up, what do you need that stuff for?" He said, "Just in case." So, Joseph, my point is, there are people out there who still believe this is going to happen.
Well said.
Yes. So he really thought the end times were here, and not nigh. They thought they were here, and that he was going to be the one to actually make it happen with his great debate. That's why he wrote all this stuff. That's why he was calling it debate. This is clearly the spirit of Joan of Arc, right? If you look at the structure of the debates and the things that he wrote and what his plans were, although he is full of himself, no question, although he thinks he's a revealer and he's blah, 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 in no way does he imagine that any of this is going to lead to secular power or wealth for himself, because he thinks it's all coming to an end. Secular power won't matter, wealth won't matter, the opinions of the masses won't matter. His game plan involves the annihilation of all cynical social rewards that he could possibly incur from positioning himself as this important person. This is one of the ways in which this is an anti-modern thing to do. A modern will claim to have God's will in order, a televangelist, right, is the classic example of a modern. The way that they relate to religion is cynically, in order to manipulate people, in order to get what they want. And so we assume, as moderns, we assume that's what everybody in the past wanted. But Joan of Arc and Pico della Mirandola, their plans didn't involve self-gratification and self-reward. It was in many ways the opposite of the motivations we would have. And what we're going to see is that Savonarola is caught in that same complex. He too will turn out to be a visionary. So to answer Sharon's question, it's complicated. It's complicated. We'll talk about it today during our 3 hours together. But Pico's ideas are shifting and drifting. And Savonarola's ideas are also shifting and drifting. Savonarola, like Pico, starts out with certain ideas about what he's going to do, and ideas isn't the right word, it suggests it's noetic. There's a lot of gnostic activity going on in his reasoning about this. And like Pico, he runs into trouble with the secular authorities and the church authorities, and it causes him to react. And as he becomes reactive, just like Pico, he finds himself backing away from positions he previously held in some cases, but doubling down on other positions and saying, well, I don't care what happens to me. I still have to stand for this thing, even if it gets me in trouble. And that's where Savonarola starts to look more like Joan of Arc. At Savonarola's end, just like Jones, you get a certain amount of recanting and saying, well, I wasn't really inspired by God, followed by recanting the recant and saying, even if it would save my life, I can't tell you that I wasn't inspired by God, because I was. And I'm sorry, the only sin here that I committed, like Joan, he said, the only sin here I committed was in denying God long enough to try to save my own life during this trial. Right? So the Medici role in this is another thing we're going to talk about today. But the Medici relationship to all of this is complicated because they sponsored Poliziano, they sponsored Pico della Mirandola, they also sponsored Savonarola.
Mhm.
It was Lorenzo who arranged to get Savonarola back, right?
Yes.
And meanwhile, Savonarola's turning around and saying there's too much Greco-Roman stuff. He's attacking the Medicis for indulging in classicism and the Plato and Aristotle and all. He's saying, oh, that's corrupting us, leading us away from God's path. And he's destroying artworks and poetry that the Medicis had been sponsoring and paying for and so forth. So the question is, how does the same guy do both of these things? And how does Lorenzo, on the one hand, get infuriated with Savonarola for doing these things, but on the other hand, support him and back him?
Mhm.
It's like there is a complicated mix of drives going on in these people with all kinds of contradictions that don't cleanly resolve themselves. You'll see them doing things that from a modern perspective, we just shake our heads and go, how is this one perspective? And it isn't, is what's
Correct.
going on, right? The worldview contains contradictions, and the different strands of the contradictions are equally passionate. And the people who hold those strands don't understand that the strands are in contradiction. They don't entirely know why they're getting these conflicts. They can't see the picture clearly, if you know what I mean, right? There's a lot of being hoist on your own petard on the one hand, while on the other hand, things go well because of your plan, but only in a different dimension. And so it's hard for you to see that you're both succeeding and failing at the same time due to the same worldview.
Well, politics and religion seem to have had quite a mixture or admixture at that time. And because their goals and intentions were so different, the messages got muddled. Not only the
Yes.
messages, but the actions got muddled.
Yes.
Particularly when it came to the behavior of the Medici and the religious establishment at that point. Because if you remember, one of the popes was actually a Medici and he was never a priest. And his sub role was just to collect money
Yes.
for the indulgences. So
Yes.
the whole thing was conflated and there was no spirituality, rationality to it. It was just very, very political.
Yeah, I mean, what we're going to see is that it's a modern perspective to say they were conflated, because from a medieval perspective, to separate them is a sin.
Mm.
It's evil to separate them, they believe. They think the whole premise of medievalism is that we're going to solve the problems of politics by bringing God into the picture. Because God is all good, God is all knowing, God is all powerful. If we work out God's will on earth, of course we'll succeed. We must.
Submission.
Right.
Submit to
Right.
God.
That core concept of Islam, of submitting the ego to God. Then what force, says Augustine, could possibly tame the ego we see on display in end times Rome at the end of the classical period? Well, God surely is powerful enough, right, to tame the human ego. And thus the entire premise of medievalism is we're going to bring in, we're going to call on Daddy to fix this problem. We're going to stop squabbling because somebody stronger and wiser than us is going to step in.
Remember though, the ego is dangerous, a dangerous material.
Well, let's turn to you, Stephen. Go ahead. You got your hand up.
Oh, yeah, well, actually, I was going to mention, this idea that ancient documents were suppressed
Yes.
is a complex one. this point that the church, for the first time in 1,000 years, put a book on its bans list. Well, there's complexity there, because if you put a book on your ban list, everybody's going to want to read it.
Right?
Now, from my understanding, that they had suppressed works in the past, but more subtly because they recognised the danger of outright banning a work. Now, an example of this is the elder Edda, which survived. That was held in secret for centuries, because if it had have been come out in public, well, it would have been burned. We have the younger Edda, Snari's version, which is an apologist work for these old people are a bit silly, but here's the stories, aren't they silly,
Right.
He puts up his apologist denial at the beginning of the work, but the elder Edda is a strictly pagan work, which is actually a lifeboat of the Teutonic paganism, which has survived to this day. We have the Hesiod, which is the Greco-Roman paganism, but that was kept under lock and key, only for the doctors, which had been, protected from by doctorate knowledge from the works of the devil, and will not succumb to the demons that are in the work. The classics did exist, but they didn't just give them out to anybody to read. There was only people which were risen up in the church and were protected against their evil emanations.
Right.
But I would suspect that the church was secretly destroying works it didn't like. And the smart move is not to publicise it. But unfortunately, of course, we have the printing press that just shown up.
Yes, the printing press has caused an enormous havoc now. Yeah,
it's complicated the situation.
It's causing a panic is what it's doing among the authorities, because they can feel their control slipping away. Their control was never very good, but they couldn't see how bad it was because they didn't have any way to see all the different variant heresies of Christianity that coexisted with them. They couldn't find them all. But once the printing press comes out and people who feel inspired by God naturally want to spread the word, and so naturally they gravitate to the printing press, and so they can make lots and lots of copies, like of the 900 Theses, and send them off to everybody. Now the church can't ignore it. It's right in front of them. And certainly you're right too, that there's a difference between a official book banning and the many other subtler forms of destruction. I mean, before the classical era, the rise of the Orthodox sect in early Christianity, they ran around destroying a lot of things. They suppressed an enormous number of variant gospels and variant epistles and so forth. They didn't just not include them in the canon, they tried to get rid of them. And they were heavily involved in the iconoclastic movement, destroying classical statues that they considered obscene, getting rid of books that they didn't like. They had a hand in the Library of Alexandria and other libraries, getting rid of their works. There had always been a movement, but it was always a movement, like we said before, that sort of happened in little spasms. There's what we can't see, and we drift around like the jellyfish until we come into contact with the thing that we don't like. And then there's a spasm of activity because now at short range, we've discovered that this other thing is there and we hate the other. We only love the self, right? But now the printing press is there, and we're starting to notice the bigger picture in little bits. So thank you for that, Stephen. That's really important. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on what you said about the transition from the medieval to the modern, the contrast. And the statement is, it's always darkest before the dawn, right? But on the other hand, you're in danger of saying it's and transforming that particular saying into is always darkest before it's black. I mean, is that what you're saying? Because a transition could either be one of contrast or one of continuum. And it seems to me you might be suggesting it is always darkest before it's black rather than before the dawn.
Well, it's safe to say that what was about to happen in the early Renaissance was among the worst crimes against humanity that ever occurred in the history of the world. We never had the power to nearly exterminate 3 populations worth of people before, right? That was a product of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment could spread propaganda faster. We were able to build munitions faster. We were able to build more powerful ships and guns, and everything was getting bigger and faster and stronger. And it allowed us to carry through our medieval intentions into this brave new world and apply them at a scale we were never able to do before. The transitional period, which it's not a thin boundary between first we were medieval and then we were modern. We're still medieval in many ways. A great deal of the definition of modernism is medievalism in a new cast, which is a despicable idea to moderns, but it's true. So the thing is, the kinds of transformations, it's not plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It's not the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's not it at all. You can see that when you see how moderns are unable to explain Joan of Arc to their satisfaction. And the only way that they're able to explain Pico is to distort him completely out of perspective. They make him a champion of freedom, breaking the chains for our free wills to go forth and do great things. It's like, but what we can see is that was not his intent at all. His intent was to bring about the culmination of God's plan, which is the opposite of liberating the free will. But throughout the 20th century, major thinkers and writers and presenters presented Pico as though he were, John Stuart Mill himself writing on liberty. You can find summations all over the internet of Pico as though he'd fit right in next to Benjamin Franklin. It's like another one of these guys. But he couldn't have been more different. He just wasn't that kind of person at all. He was a medieval.
But what would Pico have become if he ended up being Pope?
Well, see, now we get into it. So what the hell happened to Pico? Several different things happened to Pico. Let's start with Pope Innocent the Eighth. Pope Innocent the Eighth. There you go. That's Pope Innocent the Eighth. Innocent, isn't that a great name? He was not from either the Borgias or the Medicis, and he was the one who called off the Great Debate in Rome. He said, absolutely not. At first, he was just saying, well, I think there's a few of these theses you need to get right that you have wrong, like going after Thomas Aquinas. We can't have that because Thomas Aquinas is virtually our saint of logic and reason. And the whole framework of how we think of Christianity at that point depends upon Aquinas, and we can't have you poking at him. But the more they got into it and the more they looked at it, the more they realized you got to think like a Banausos. Think noetically. You are in charge of a massive continent-spanning organization with rules and momentum and wealth and investments. And all of this depends upon keeping people believing the recipe of things that has allowed you to get this far. There are a number of parts of that recipe that, if they change, maybe you wouldn't care too much, but there's other parts that cannot be tampered with because it's a house of cards. Or put another way, it's a Rube Goldberg machine. You can't tug on this without breaking 18 other things. There's certain key parts of the framework that can't be messed with. And among the things that the Orthodox Church established very early on was a solution to the problem that Jesus said, during my lifetime, you will see all of these things come to pass. And then they didn't. And the Orthodox Church had come up with a solution for that. But they remembered how close they had come to everything falling apart just over that issue. You can't say that the end times will happen on a certain date, or you lose an enormous number of followers the day after that. Then the church knew that. They knew it in their bones. It was one of the core lessons of how you keep the medieval church together. That you cannot put a date on it. And here along comes Pico, who says, not only am I going to put a date on it, I'm going to define a whole sequence of events, and I'm going to invite all the leading thinkers from all over Europe, and we'll all be there together on that date. So nobody can miss it. And we'll all be looking right at it. And you got to think, even though he never came out and said it, innocent is looking at this going, this is going to be a disaster, right? This incredibly charismatic, creative, highly educated guy with connections all over Europe is going to bring everybody together and do a giant failed prophecy right in front of us. You know, Innocent sees the disaster that's possible. And so he calls it all off and, you know, and pushes back hard to get Pico to back down, because this is the exact same problem the Orthodox Church had in the 200s and 300s.
Mm-hmm.
Charismatic speakers who come out of the desert filled with passion for God are a force of chaos in an organized, structured church. There has always been a massive collision between the Pauls of the church and the Peters of the church, or the Jameses of the church. The people who depend upon the structure and the stability and the hierarchy, who want everybody to follow the rules, are not happy when you get these people coming out saying, last night God spoke to me and he said, forget about all those things that you've been doing for the last, 100 years. Here's your new thing that you're supposed to do. And the reason is that so many people did it and they all said different things. And this breeds confusion. Who's actually speaking for God and who's not speaking for God? Like, they saw early on that it attracted con artists, people who weren't filled with the passion at all, but who saw a way to get rich quick. You can find bits in the very early church writings where they say, well, I suppose itinerant preachers are still okay, but make sure they don't stay any more than 1 to 3 days. Because if they're staying more than that, it might be a con artist and they're just trying to, live off your money. This is in the New Testament and in other early writings. These warnings against people who are going to take advantage of your belief system. They were seeing the chaos. And likewise, I've shared the link before. I will share it again right now. earlychristianwritings.com. If you've never looked at this site, you have to look at this site. This is a compendium of just the writings we know about, not the ones we don't know about. We know there were more than this.
Yes.
How many gospels, how many epistles, how many apocalypses, and so forth were created during the first few hundred years of Christianity. And it goes way beyond the canon, and it goes way beyond the Catholic Apocrypha. It is an enormous list of things that were produced. And the official position is the ones in the canon are the real books, and the ones out of the canon are the fakes, or not real books, or what have you. But the perspective from the Orthodox Church is really interesting at the beginning of this period, which is, this is in a worse form the same problem of the random charismatic itinerant preacher, because now they're putting it in writing and spreading it around. And so, what does Jesus stand for? What is his mission? What are we supposed to do is being yanked back and forth by all these charismatic people. If the Orthodox Church can't get that under control, there's never going to be a medieval period. There's never going to be a coherent church. It's just going to be splintered to the wind. So back in the 100s, 200s, and 300s, the major struggle, although now we say the major struggle was against Romans and, oppression and so forth. There actually isn't a lot of archaeological evidence for that. The major struggle was against the other sects, fighting for, could we create one coherent set of beliefs that could organize people and that wasn't being overturned every other week by a new wild-eyed preacher from the desert coming in and saying, now the agreements are all off. I have a new one, right? So this is Chekhov's gun in some ways. This is at the beginning of the play, you see the gun on the mantelpiece and nobody mentions it or talks about it, but you know that before the end of the third act, that gun is going to be fired. That's why it's there, right? It's the inescapable part of the story. So for the medieval epoch, the inescapable part of the story is that they were constantly struggling between, on the one hand, wanting everything to be inspired by God, because that was the entire promise of the medieval epoch, that we can make economics be governed by God. We can make politics be governed by God. We can make social relations be governed by God. And in that way, we will end the corruption of the ancient era. That's the promise. And so divine inspiration is the point. But the problem is there's too many people saying that they're divinely inspired and they're all saying contradictory things, and you can't get a coherent movement out of that. So at the same time that they have to enshrine divine inspiration, they also have to suppress it as much as possible. They have to keep it from shaking people around from one thing to the next. They're trying to make a stable system of relationships, and that doesn't call for aristoi, it calls for banausoi, because banausoi are systematizers, organizers, right? If you want an orthodoxy, you don't want an Aristos. You don't want Vernunft. You don't want people being inspired, whether by God or by logic or by nature or what have you. Inspiration is a problem. Original inspiration at the beginning is fine, but once it's done, you need to then ban it and push it out and have all the focus after that be on, let us logically, systematically, and stably carry through the consequences of that original inspiration. That's the recipe. Go ahead, Jenny.
I just missed your which play were you talking about? Chekhov's play. I missed that.
Oh, any play. This is Chekhov's critique of how plays work.
Okay.
The unexamined.
Yeah, because I did the play Three Sisters off Broadway, and I know even in that play, there was a gun that that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, he wrote and talked about the theory of drama, and he said, yeah, if you've got some conspicuous thing that nobody ever mentions, but that's out in the open and everybody can see it from the beginning of the play, like a gun on a mantle, you know it isn't a story unless by the end of the story, that thing which has always been present becomes part of the story. So the gun will be picked up and fired. So wild-eyed, inspired, crazy people from the desert who see visions from God are going to be with the medieval epoch from before the beginning until after its end, just by the very nature of the structure of the whole thing. That's going to be their central struggle. So this is why Innocent VIII knows exactly what he's looking at when he sees Pico. And he hears about the 900 Theses and he starts reading them. And he hears about the great debate in Rome and the invitations being sent out. There is absolutely zero chance that Innocent VIII can miss this. He knows exactly what's at stake in a way that Pico doesn't. Because the reason that the hierarchy of the medieval church is still in charge is that they're the ones who pay attention to these things. If they didn't pay attention to them, they would be blindsided and it would all fall apart. Right? The internal Banausic culture is you have to suppress this kind of thing. You have to, or you lose everything. Right? They want to be fighting against Islam. They want to be spreading over Africa and Asia and so on. They don't want to be fighting amongst each other because if they fight amongst each other, they get weak instead of strong. So they're thinking systematically. All right, you with me so far? This is part of what I'm trying. This is how Pico initially gets into trouble. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. That seems like the part of the problem of modernity too, because on the one hand, you want individual to be liberated, so everybody have access to that liberation of understanding. But on the other hand, you also know that's dangerous to society because, in theory, the lower end of it are always very gullible and they could persuade it by insane orators or whatever to move in a certain direction, right. As we recently had a president. But nonetheless, in some sense, that has to be restricted, on the other hand, by a kind of like the esotericism has to be restricted to an elite class who can handle that understanding and not spread it around and control it. So that tension is itself existing in the whole idea of modernity, because you have these two poles that on the one hand, let's liberate them. No, let's not. Let's tighten the screws a bit. We'll release these things slowly so that people are not. I think in that sense, certainly it's true that medievalism continues in that sense.
Yes, I've heard people inexactly but interestingly refer to modernity or capitalism specifically as economic medievalism.
Yeah.
You still have a lord, you still have serfs,
Yeah.
you still have a very hierarchical, non-democratic relationship. And the argument is, if you don't like this company, go start one of your own, except we all know that the marketplace doesn't work that way. You have to have a lot of money if you want to succeed, or get very lucky, or both. So there are ways in which we carry forward these medieval relationships with each other, even in our everyday lives. You know, the whole time we're awake, there's medievalism going on. But more generally, what we're seeing here, if I step away from medievalism and modernism for a second, it goes to illustrating Kenneth Smith's psychodynamics, right? The relationship between douloi, banausoi, and aristoi is that banausoi are very good at systems. But the problem is the things that go wrong in the systems they make are intrinsic to their banausic character. Mm-hmm. It is precisely because they drive out that relationship with nature that allows for intrusive flashes of insight and wisdom that makes them unable to keep going for the long term. It's why they become corrupted, because they can't overcome the temptations. A banausos can't overcome the temptations the way an aristos can, because the banausos doesn't fundamentally believe in anything the way an aristos does. You know what I mean? It's like, yes, if you are absolutely committed to saving people's lives, if for you it's not about just making money, but you are passionately driven to do it, you will make all kinds of sacrifices of your own personal interests in order to make that happen. But if you don't actually believe in saving people's lives, if you're just wearing the mask of that to get more business, and what you really believe in is making money, then there are a number of temptations that are, you know, any tragedian could write a play to show sooner or later in walks the temptation that you are not prepared to handle because you don't actually believe in anything. And that temptation will draw you off of what you say your mission is onto what it really is, which is self-aggrandizement. There is a conflict between self-aggrandizement and any other virtue that an aristos understands, but a banausos intrinsically cannot understand.
Well, that's always been my problem with the atheists and the rationalists altogether.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. That's what I'm talking about here. Exactly.
To this day, they're still playing the same game.
Yeah, and any banausos can do it, including banausoi who don't think that they're atheists or don't think they're rationalists. It's not what they think they are or what they say they are, but what are they actually internally? If their character has been built around the gravity well of noesis, and they think logically, rationally, systematically, and they don't trust feelings, experiences, nature, insight, crazy wild-eyed people from the desert, if they try to suppress all of that stuff, they inevitably go to corruption. That's the end game. No matter how hard they try to avoid it, it's just built right in. And so what we see in the series of popes, including Innocent VIII, is people who are very, very savvy, who come from a 1,000-year tradition of how to be systematically prudent, organizationally coherent. They know a Pico when they see one. But the problem is they're so focused on external problems, they don't notice their own internal corruption. You know, they can sign up for a doctrine of discovery in which they're basically justifying enslaving most of humanity and not see anything wrong with it, and not see that they're exactly in opposition to Jesus's message. How can you say you're loving one another if you're committing genocide and engaging in slavery on a scale never seen before on the face of the earth? And the answer is they can't see it because they're not actually loyal to Jesus's message. They're loyal to the Noetic banausic system that they have erected over the last 1,000 years. That they understand. But the reason that it exists, they don't actually understand. Banausoi aren't capable of understanding principles at that level. They're not real to them. So yes, human meat is motivated by crazy and the emotional. There's this whole, the juiciness of life comes from all the stuff they're trying to suppress. Joseph, then Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
Just briefly, I mean, it's really, this is very, very interesting because I mean, what you're starting to see is the power of dogma.
Yes.
And how important that is in order to kind of dominate a narrative. And that kind of, it's unfortunate because you see this in a number of organizations as well. I mean, just even corporations or whatever it may be. But it's also kind of like that the church knows that if you go at the heart of its power, then they know, like, what is questioning some of these truths that they're putting out there, that they'll lose, they'll lose their validity. Right. As far as economics, as far as governments, and as all these other things are concerned. What's interesting to see is how the church reinvents itself over and over again, though, behind the scenes.
Yes,
that's a very important thing to kind of recognize, is that they're dogmatic, but they impose their dogmatism in different ways.
Yes.
They don't necessarily do things overtly as much as they once did. I mean, we know about these discussions that that have taken place, but now I think you start to see this where the church understands that dogma is no longer going to be accepted.
Yes.
That they tend to work with non-dogmatic organizations, but they still maintain the power because of their systematized ways of thinking, if that makes sense.
It does.
So it's interesting that this dogma is what keeps them alive, and to actually understand the psychological aspects behind it and how that actually maps into how these systems work. This is super fascinating. This is connecting a lot of dots for me in particular. I appreciate this, but it's very important to notice, though, that this is not something that it's not even overt anymore. That's a very important part of kind of seeing how the church has evolved over the years. Yeah. It's much more in the background, because they know people don't necessarily subscribe to dogma unless they're forced to. Right. Which they can be. Anyway, I said
there's this.
I don't know.
It's good stuff. I mean, there's this interesting phenomenon once we pass through into the modern epoch. Once there isn't a unified drive for worldwide totalitarian control of people's thoughts, once the focus of the power structures in Christianity stop being about that and start being about, rather than all agreeing about the same thing, at least on the surface, what if we each authentically pursue what we most believe to be true about Jesus and God and spirituality and so forth? At that moment, it's a breath of fresh air in Christianity. All kinds of suppressed movements rise back up because they represent people's, genuine beliefs, closer to a real faith and not an imposed dogma. And all kinds of healthy things happened coming out of that. Now, you'll see rationalists frequently criticize Christianity for not agreeing on what Christianity is. But that's because they fail to understand the lessons of the medieval era. And the lesson is, you can't impose spirituality on people by fiat. It is, by definition, not authentic. What Charlemagne said, the cross or the sword, you convert or you die, and thereby wiped out all kinds of heathen and pagan cultures across Europe. That is not a recipe that leads to authentic spirituality, right? What leads to authentic spirituality is letting people explore what they believe to be true, what they understand to be true, what they feel to be true. Even if along the way there are errors and mistakes, you're going to get a cleaner, healthier religion out of it. Or more importantly, you're going to get dozens and dozens of religions out of it, not a single religion out of it, but they're all going to be in better shape than any single, imposed totalitarian dogma. Because otherwise, when there's only one, when there can be only one, when they follow the Roman model, right? Remember, the Roman model, the improvement of the Roman model over the Greek model is, instead of many city-states, there's now only one city-state. Instead of Athens and Sparta and Corinth, now there's only Rome. And the belief was that would unite us. But what it did instead is it became a festering pool for corruption, because now everybody was fighting over the same thing. If we didn't like the way things were going, we had to fight for control and take it away from you so that we could impose what we wanted to believe. And it was natural that out of that came the medieval church. But once the medieval church lost its grip, then all of the splinter sects of Christianity could go their own way, pursue what they actually believed, and you got better religions. Even the Roman Catholic Church, which many people equate with the medieval church, is a different church today than it was then. So they've got different beliefs, they've got a different hierarchy, different structures, different kinds of theology. Many things have changed. And not necessarily in a way that betrays the faith, the way that some of the old guard within the Catholic Church think, but in many ways in a way that allows it to be truer to itself than it could be when it was all tangled up with the politics of the day. You can't look at this series of popes that we're walking through right now, who are jerking papal policy back and forth depending upon which king or emperor they're aligning with, and say that this is the will of God. It's just too volatile. At the same time that the thing that they're promising is stability, the thing that they're devoted to through their Noetic monastic perspective is stability. Through that very focus, they're creating this incredibly unstable theology that's just hopping back and forth from one power broker to another, right? It's part of the difference between contradiction and paradox, that it is an inevitable paradoxical result that when you try to tie these things together the way that they did in the medieval epoch, your stability produces instability. It's not just there for story purposes or to make it cute or ironic. It is inescapable that drive for stability, the way that they're doing it, will lead to instability. It's intrinsic, it's dialectical, it's inescapable. It's core to the recipe of who they are. And so therefore breaking free from it finally gets them out of that trap, and they can try to be more authentic. Joseph, you were going to have a follow-up.
Yeah, just one really quick follow-up. I'll just say it's interesting to see how it's the unifying thing is no longer God but power, in that how essentially how the Catholic Church realizes that they're not going to get it through followers, so that they actually have to work in conjunction with other religious sects, Christian sects specifically, in order to maintain its power. That's a very different dynamic than what we saw, with the Reformation. But it shows you how it evolves, how these power structures evolve, and that they understand that fragment. So you see evangelicals and Christians coming together, and Catholics, in a way that you would have never have seen even 50 years ago or 75 years ago. So, but it's interesting to see that the mindset that that brings it, and that creates this environment where you kind of create this. They're only unifying around one thing now, and that's power.
Yeah,
that's always been the case, but they used to be able to. These religious sects used to be able to do it on their own. Now they can't. So it's interesting to see the church, the evangelicals, and the Christians together as a religious group come together under not under God, under this idea of being relevant. It's just something. It's interesting to see. Anyway.
And I'm glad you called attention to it, because ecumenical Catholicism is one of the most wondrous developments of the modern epoch, because it is in many ways the antithesis of the medieval Catholic Church. The medieval Catholic Church, ecumenicalism was a heresy. The whole point was one set of beliefs will be set out across the entire world. And the idea of saying, not only are we going to allow it, are we going to give up on that, but we're going to literally embrace other sects as having access to wisdom, and that we should work together. This is a complete inversion of that core original genocidal totalitarian impulse. It has become a humanizing thing instead of a dehumanizing thing. It's marvelous. There are plenty of things in the modern epoch that are problematic, but by the same token, and for the same reasons, there are plenty of things in the modern epoch that are wonderful and surprising, and that's one of them. Again, a good Greek tragedian or playwright could make a great story out of how this 1,000-year institution turned itself inside out and ended up standing for in that dimension, the opposite of what it had professed before, because it realized that eventually, unwillingly, due to the developments of history, it realized that the totalitarian part of its program had always been in opposition to the Jesus-centered part of its program. It couldn't, it started the epoch believing it could have both, but by now it comes to understand it can't, and it has to choose. And it chooses the better one. The better one being, love one another, not stomp out all heresy. But it took them a long time to let go, right? It was a hard one lesson.
Well, it's stomping out a different type of heresy, though, in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is it's still dangerous. It's still very dangerous. And it's still just a different type of dogma. It's just a question of it's kind of just, I don't know, morphing into something else that we haven't seen before.
Now the struggle's about something different.
Much different. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So Sharon, and then Phil, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Sharon.
I am making the observation that the church and politics has always had a relationship because of the power. And when Constantine decided to adopt Christianity for the Roman Empire, it was not so much about the edict, it was the power. It was the unifying power of the church, as he used it to run the failing Roman Empire. And so I think the dogma of the church, whether it's in the medieval time or the modern time, is constantly changing. Because in my impression of religion, there's one central thing to all of this. It's being run by humans. The gospel, whatever it is being run by humans. And whether they're operating as Banisoi or Dulai or Aristoi, it just depends on the predominant character at the time for the edict that's being expressed. And the Catholic Church and all the churches, even today, the church is still in an evolution because they've chosen three central points: immigration, abortion, and homosexuality. That's the gospel of Jesus right now for the church. But it has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus. Absolutely nothing. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, so Pico gets in trouble and he gets arrested. And then he goes back to live in Florence with Lorenzo, who you mentioned in the first part of the thing. And Savonarola comes to live with him. I can't figure out how they sorted out that debacle because he continues to write. And he was in trouble, A, because he challenges, I think, the way I understood it, the dogma of the church, and B, because he embraced all these other teachings from the Muslims, from the Jews, and that probably raised a lot of questions in the religious hierarchy of the time.
Right.
So I wanted to know how Savonarola helped him sort out the pickle he got himself in.
It's hard because about the time that he's helping out Pico, Savonarola is digging himself in deeper and making things worse for himself. He only lasts 2 years after Pico. And he and two other friars are hanged in Rome with fires under them to consume their bodies afterwards so that there's no relics left for anybody to make saints of them. Savonarola ends up executed. And what you see is Savonarola discovers a path that calls to him. And the more he goes down that path, the more he changes, and the less freedom he has to back out of it, even if it would hurt him. He becomes drawn into a gravity well in some ways. And he doubles down on preaching against the corruption in the church, on preaching against mistreatment of the poor, which is a point I didn't emphasize last week, and I should have.
Yes,
he was a major advocate for the poor, and he was criticizing wealth and the wealthy, including the wealthy in the church. So he was tying, church corruption and wealth and mistreatment of the poor together into one theme, and thereby uniting the secular and religious authorities against him. But where he really got himself in trouble is that his, as a visionary, things would come to him that just made sense to him. The way that this is always what happens with visionaries. You find a mix of the profound and the ridiculous side by side, because we don't share their perspective. And some of the things that they found compelling, one of them will find profound and the other one will find absurd, because we're not seeing the world from that same angle. We see a distinction between the prophecies that they're not able to see. So when he's preaching against corruption and mistreatment of the poor and all that, we can all get behind that. Mm-hmm. But then he also is inspired to believe that the cause of the corruption is all this newfangled classicism and exposure to the Greeks and the Romans. That's what's corrupting us, he believes. And so that's what leads him into bonfires of the vanities. That's why he starts burning books, burning paintings. And the moment he's doing that, now the Medici who are backing him are now like, Jesus, Savonarola, knock it off. Do you even know what it is to have an ally? Do you really have to bite everybody around you until nobody likes you? It's like the inability to form and keep alliances is a constant hazard of visionaries, right? Because their real allegiance is to the vision, which they feel is more profound than their own life. And so they'll give up their friends and their family and everybody in order to chase the vision. We see this over and over throughout the thousands of years of visionaries that we have documented. And so it all depends on what makes sense to the visionary, whether the result of the visions cohere into a real humanist, powerful driving force, or whether, as with Savonarola and many others, you instead get a mixed bag in which some of it is brilliant and other parts are not only not brilliant, but brilliantly bad, causing major problems. What Europe didn't need at that period was to throw away the Greeks and Romans and the Muslims and the Jews. What they needed was to pull that stuff in more firmly and learn more from it, right? That's what Pico thought. He said, look at the power of these thinkers. Look how profound they are. Look how logical they are. They're amazing. We have to introduce that into medievalism to improve medievalism. That was where Pico started. But Savonarola ends up going, no, we just have to go back to the more pure form. We have to go just back to Jesus and things that Jesus said and Paul said. And well, maybe he allows for the apocalypse of John, sure. But none of this other newfangled stuff. It's all a distraction from God. This is what Savonarola thinks. Mm-hmm. And so Savonarola turns on the people who would have been his best allies. Which causes problems, right? But that's not really where Savonarola got himself all the way into trouble. We'll come to that later in this session. Savonarola Savonarola failed to take a political position that a pope wanted him to take. And by so doing, the pope decided he was his enemy. And that was the beginning of the end for Savonarola. Because the pope that we're going to talk about in a little bit, he was caught up in a major political struggle that's happening right then. Literally, we've got kings marching on Italy. We've got popes taking sides. We've got everybody, all the city-states are coming down one side or the other of this great conflict between this king and the pope who's taken the other side. And it just polarizes everything and causes a great deal of well, let's say some tragic ends come about as a result of that, including Savonarola's. We'll talk about it in a moment. I don't want to get too far into it before we're ready. But so what you're going to, so this is the thing. By the end of his life, I'm going to wrap up Pico here. By the end of his life, Savonarola convinced Pico. Pico, who had been a syncretist and a classicist and an academicist, comes to believe Savonarola's position that what's needed is purification, not ecumenicalism, not cosmopolitanism. Those things are bad. What's needed is parochialism and focus. We just need to discipline ourselves and become, pure, perfect embodiments of Christ's mission. And if we would do that, then everything would be great. And as we'll see when we get into it, Savonarola is having Joan of Arc style visions in which he's starting to prophesy the future for Florence and what's going to happen as a result of doing this. And all kinds of things go astray. But Pico, demoralized by his experience with the earlier Pope, he ends up deciding Savonarola must be right, and he burns his own poetry. He joins in on the bonfires of vanities and purification, abnegation. So it doesn't end so well for him. One thing about Pico I should mention is that although Pope Innocent VIII halted the debate, ended up, saying the 900 Theses are not allowed and banning them and condemning them and condemning him as being involved in heresy, the next Pope, Alexander VI, ends up clearing Pico. He doesn't unban the book, but he clears Pico and says, you're not a heretic, you were just misguided. So Pico doesn't end his life being accused of being a heretic. He's cleared by the next Pope, who is, by the way, the Borgia Pope. Alexander VI is Rodrigo Borgia. He like the previous one it gets involved in the New World and Spain and Portugal, and he doubles down on the doctrine of discovery and says, yeah, kill all those savages and enslave them, and if they die, that's unfortunate, but at least they will die under Christian masters, and maybe that way we can save some of their souls, and it's okay if millions and millions die so that we can save some of them for God. It's better that most of them die, but we get a few of them for God, than that all of them live happily. That would be bad. We have to stop that. So, and he's also involved in the partition of the New World, which part goes to Portugal and which part goes to Spain. He chops up North and South America for those two European countries. So he's got his fingers deeply entwined with this political stuff and with the wealth that's involved. He's just as corrupt, as the guy before him and as the guy who comes after him. They're all deeply, deeply corrupt people who are promulgating policies that are among the most evil policies people have promulgated in the history of the world. They're not the very most evil, it's hard to say what the most evil is, but if you were drawing a big circle and trying to put all the most evil stuff in there, the things that these guys, the doctrine of discovery is right up there. That was basically justifying 100 million deaths, which, is appalling at a hideous scale. So Pico gets unhereticked, if you will, by Alexander VI, but he still comes out of the experience chastened and demoralized, and he ends up submitting to Savonarola's ideas because Savonarola never turned on him. Savonarola is one friend who always stood by him, and so he says, well, you must be right, my things have led me astray, and he burns his own poetry and stuff and becomes a monk, and then he ends up poisoned along with they're both assassinated late in life after they can no longer hurt anybody. They're done in. And let me see, I gotta get, it's arsenic, right? Arsenic. Poliziano and Pico both died of arsenic poisoning. So whether that was Lorenzo's son Piero or whether that was somebody else, we may never know. But at that point in his life, he wasn't really hardly a problem for anybody. So it's hard to say who really had it in for him. Okay. So Savonarola, the late stage of Savonarola beliefs come after that. The last 2 years of Savonarola's life, which we'll talk about today, are really interesting. And they're part of what inspired Martin Luther. But we'll get into that. So this is the thing that happens. Visionaries have a tendency to have very uncomfortable lives, right? Joan of Arc, executed, right? Savonarola, executed. Pico, assassinated. All these people who bring charisma and inspiration and powerful ideas, who shake the foundations of the world with their beliefs, usually get offed. They usually get offed in this period. And it's not an accident. And it's not just human nature. it is the monastic power structure defending itself against disruption because it knows what's at stake. It cannot afford to have everything come apart at the seams because it knows it's a house of cards. It knows how completely it could come apart. You get this weird thing where these visionaries have this, for even the fire and brimstone ones, like Savonarola eventually becomes really angry in his prophecy. Well, on the one hand, really angry, and on the other hand, hugely overreaching about the glories that will come to Florence if it follows his preachings. On the one hand, they can be dark. You can have Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, sure. But on the other, there is this amazing idealism involved in them. They believe that they can shake the foundations of the world and the world will still be okay. They think there's a way forward. And all people have to do is the right thing and it'll all work out. And they'll tell everybody what the right thing is, right, for whatever reason, whether it's for personal glory or because it's just they actually believe God's talking to them. But they think it will come out all right in the end. And they're usually assassinated or executed by people who don't share that faith. They don't believe that it will come out all right in the end. They think there are certain things that you cannot mess with without endangering us all. They look back to the worst periods and the worst times and they say, the one thing above all as Pope that I have to do is make sure that I don't preside over the collapse from what we have now to how bad things used to be. I can't let that happen. And I would do anything to keep that from happening, even offing somebody charismatic and brilliant and maybe even inspired by God, but probably not. They probably don't believe that Savonarola is inspired by God. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, while I agree that it's a lot of that has to do with the struggle for power, I think a lot of it has also to do with the limitations of human consciousness itself as well. And yesterday I was in a meetup, and toward the end of the meetup, it became two guys arguing about who's right.
Right.
And after quite a bit of argument, I said, I'm glad I'm not expert enough to wave around my credentials so that I could just try to make sense of what this is all about. And I actually enjoyed the complexities and contradictions so I could make up my own mind.
Right.
That's what I said. And it seems to me that's what modern art was trying to do. Modern art wasn't trying so much to criticize any particular system itself. It was trying to make things complex and difficult and contradictory, that there's a tension in which they hoped that humanity could, in a sense, not grasp the contradictions so that they could be involved in trying to figure out what the hell is this all about, right?
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that it became too difficult for most people to live in a state of complexity and contradictions.
Yes.
And so they eventually evolved to a point of trying to understand something that reveals the outlines of the forms. Now we get it. And so you have somebody like Mondrian, they say, okay, let's reduce this to the simplicity of the forms and let's throw away all the excesses so we have the pure form itself, right? And so that in a sense, is the way it is, which means that, okay, most people can say, oh, now I get it. So most people are followers rather than self-thinkers. And that being the case, it almost seems like it's inevitable that anything that projects a kind of complexity and contradiction and chaos and require you to find order within the chaos itself, and this is your responsibility, becomes almost contradictory to what his purpose eventually is. So I think that's I think that's what we're stuck with, and I think that's why my paintings have been talking about the fallen angels, because we are in that state. And it just seems to me like, so yeah, you could have these sort of charismatic leaders, but if you have people who are used to trying to figure out what the contradictions and complexities are, then you could say they're not going to be persuaded so easily, right? The fact that they could be lured in, and if you have a population, and I'm not going to put exact number on it, an exact proportion, but a majority of the people could easily persuade it in a certain way, that there's almost no hope for salvation except to create a power structure in which you will tell them
Right.
what the hell this is all about. And,
Right.
And you make it simple enough, say, oh, I get it. It's Papa Joe. Tell us what to do. It's like, I think it is a noble idea to try to condition people into understanding that the nature of understanding itself, the nature of the universe, it's just highly complex, and we got to be ready for it. And that, in a sense, any particular system is by its way incomplete. We are on a journey. We're not there yet. Like, have some patience. We're not there yet. Look out for some possibilities that might pop up. And it's like, but people wanted to get to that destiny. That's why I used the metaphor, like, when you're the dad, you're driving the station wagon on a vacation trip, and all the kids are jumping up and down. Are we there yet?
Uh-huh.
and you say, no, like, just wait. And so you finally have to, like, range your authority, say, shut the hell up. And so even you become impatient, and it's like, I don't know what to do. It just seems like, and that's deep down, I think, the frustration of democratic ideals, right? Because, like, the people who could give you kind of the delusion of the simple solutions, or the delusion like the other guys are wrong and whatever, is like, it's going to win the day easier, simply because your solution is so intricate and complex, and you actually said, well, I actually don't have an answer. Look, people are not going to like it. So I think it's really both. And I think because of that, it's easier for the power structure to manipulate the structure than say, I have a plan. Let's try not to understand it. It's complex. It's whatever. You're not gonna get very far. It's like, so I think that's where we're at. So I just want to add that.
Yeah, it's hard. You're right. We're dealing with some really difficult issues, and what we find is that those difficult issues are right at the center of everything we want to do. How do we know what's even real? How do we know what the right and wrong thing are to do? These are really basic questions, right? What do I know and what should I do is like somewhere right up there with, where how am I going to eat lunch? It's on the short list, right, of things we need to be clear about. And what we find is that although, if we're fortunate, we can come up with an answer to what we're going to eat for lunch, it's really hard to come up with a how do I want to say, an answer to the questions about what do I know and what's right and wrong that isn't self-contradictory and full of problems.
Well, the problem is intensified because back ages ago, there was a lot of space that separate different sects of population, a lot of distance.
Right.
So you could have a lot of diversity developing locally and regionally, and they're pretty much left alone until the conqueror comes, with the bigger guns or whatever. So there's a lot of diversity, and a lot of the systems are, while they're not perfect, they're kind of okay in their own way, right? But now, like, space and time has collapsed. You know, like what's happening in Ukraine is right here. What's happening in Taiwan is here. Even during the Vietnam War, it's over there. We could criticize it, but it's really doesn't touching us. You know, it's like it's collapsed. And with the media now the way it is, like, you know, the milliseconds, it's here, right? You're not shielded by a time to, in a sense, sort things out. So you're put in the position of immediate response, and which makes the complexity even more complex, because you don't have time to say, well, you know, it's happening next town. Let's try and figure out what's going on there. Maybe it won't happen to us. It's like time and space has collapsed.
Yeah.
And that has made a big difference on human beings, because we're much used to, you know, the horizon being further away.
Yeah.
And now the horizon is right up in your face.
All the horizons are in our face.
Exactly. So that's a problem, because our mental capacity with dealing time and space, which is so fundamental to who we are, is like, it's immediate, right? Unless you want to just, like I said, move to Montana and live on no media, and then you're kind of like out of it, like, oh, like what's going on? So I don't know. So
well, there's some parallels between this epoch and the epoch of Pico and Savonarola.
Yeah,
like the printing press and the internet. There's a relationship between them as far as bringing distant horizons into our face. Here we are. Not only are we worried about a volcanic eruption in the Pacific at a scale we haven't seen before, which is a different place, we're worried about who assassinated Pico della Mirandola, and that's 1492. That's a long time ago, right? But we're talking about it, and it's relevant, and it's charged with significance for us. That distant time, over half a millennium ago, has now become of the moment. It's what we're doing. And this conflation of time and space, you're right. Homo sapiens didn't evolve to do this, right? This didn't used to happen. There's a similar analog in the late Roman Empire, which was an era of maximal cosmopolitanism. I mean, people from Africa, Europe, and Asia, from the far, you know, what used to be far distant places, they were being picked up by Roman emperors, and whole populations and villages were being picked up and moved to the other side of the empire. You know, temples to African deities and Asian deities were being erected in England, and vice versa, right? There were English pagan deities had temples, you know, on the Asian steppes and in North Africa, because all these people are shifting around and moving places. And so whatever was viable or sustainable in the local cultures, it had never evolved to deal with this level of disruption. And so everything was being challenged. So this thing you talk about from time to time, Phil, it's like sometimes we need quiet times when we can just rest and heal and recuperate. And any viable culture has to include a healthy amount of that. If all it does is relentless, adapt, run, go, shake up the world, you know, the end is nigh. That's usually one of the signs that there's going to be a massive change, because people can't take it anymore. And they couldn't take it in Pico's time, and they couldn't take it in Augustine's time, and they don't seem to be taking it very well in this time either. Neither of these three times are some of those quiet times that can go on for centuries, that give people the room they need to deal with life. Stephen, you got your hand up, but before I call on you, I just want to thank you for reminding us about the Ottomans being at the gates of Europe. I went and looked that up, and I want to take just a couple of minutes to expand on what you said, and then I'll call on you, because I think what you said there in the comments is way too important to miss. So obviously, one of the things that happens very early on in the medieval epoch is the split between the Eastern and Western churches. Obviously, if you really study the history of Christianity, you know that those are only two of, like, I don't know, a dozen different early churches that are elsewhere, further east, Africa, multiple churches in Africa, and each one's got its own, the Pope is just the Bishop of Rome and the Roman Church, but you've also got the patriarchs of Constantinople, and you've got other patriarchs and leaders, in Ethiopia and in Alexandria, Syria, and further east. So that split between Constantinople and Rome in the church, the big split, right? Because they have such a large population, is an example of the victory of the medieval epoch at the end of the classical era and the beginning of the, at the end of the revolution, as being a defeat at the same time, because they come roaring out of the gate, as I say, with 17 heresies beside them. Right out of the gate, even the part that's non-heretical is already split in two and never unites to this day, right? Split this whole time. They're supposed to work together. They're supposed to recognize the fact that even though they have doctrinal differences and different power structure, they're both trying to spread Jesus' message on earth. They both agree about the core idea of the medieval proposition. By putting God in charge, we will drive out corruption, because God is the one pure thing and the one thing powerful enough to overcome any obstacle. God's all powerful. Corrupt human agents are of limited power. They're mortal. Therefore, God should win. This should work. But despite that, the differences between them, they never heal the rift. And the rift stays bad enough that the Fourth Crusade ends up being diverted to Constantinople and ends up sacking Constantinople, burning the Library of Constantinople, which, by the way, holds most of what used to be the contents of the Library of Alexandria, because most of them weren't destroyed. They were moved to Byzantium, which a little piece of history of the library most people don't know. An incalculable loss for the history of Western civilization. I mean, like, what we have left of the Roman and Greek authors is probably less than half of what we had before the sacking of Constantinople. It was just massive amounts of culture and knowledge were lost forever. And it was Christians doing it. It was Roman Christians destroying knowledge and destroying their fellow Christians. And Innocent III, the Pope at the time, we're talking, this is like 1198, just before 1200. Innocent III, who was a pretty powerful Pope, and he was compared to these later popes we're talking about, he was pretty good. He was, and by good, I don't mean he was a good person. I actually would, say, hey, here's a great guy. We should all be like him. But I mean, he wasn't corrupt the way that they're corrupt. He really embodied the promise of the medieval papacy about as well as anybody could. He really believed in what he was doing. But he was horrified when he realized that they had destroyed Constantinople. Now, after that, Constantinople recovers, but it's just never the same. And Constantinople has been called the gates of Europe because it's at the narrow point on the transition over from Asia Minor, which means countless would-be conquerors are stopped right there because Constantinople still has the greatest defenses of any city left over from the ancient world. It was never destroyed the way Rome was repeatedly at the end of the Roman period. It's got these amazing walls. You might think in Lord of the Rings that the great city of the South that's fighting against Sauron in the third movie. Everything's centered around that city. That is modeled after Constantinople. Impregnable walls at a scale that contemporary people couldn't imagine building anything that powerful and that amazing. And they had all the knowledge at their disposal. They knew Greek fire. Before the sacking of Constantinople, they still knew how to do Greek fire and amazing siege engines and so forth. So they were holding back the tide, as it were. If you're looking for a shorthand history of 5,000 years, 6,000 years of European history, the shorthand is wave after wave of nomadic invaders coming from Asia. That's the shorthand history in a nutshell. Even the Celts, the Indo-Europeans, even people we think of as indigenous to Europe were previous invaders who came from the East. That's what Europe looks like And so to be able to have a strong defense helps to create a kind of stability for Europe that it hasn't had, right? Constantinople played a major role in preventing Islam from pouring into Europe from the east, for example. It did pour in from the west. It came in through Spain, and almost, it crossed the Pyrenees but got rebuffed. But it would have come in from the east too. And
Sicily as well.
Sicily as well. Sicily is also, right, coming straight across the Mediterranean. If they had not only taken Sicily and Spain, but also come in from the east, there's reason to think Islam could have taken Europe. Europe was pretty weak. It was pretty backwards, scientifically benighted. They didn't know warfare nearly as well as the Muslims did. They weren't as educated as the Muslims were. And they were very divided against each other. The shorthand story of Ireland is a king on every hill. They're all fighting amongst each other all the time. And Europe's history, in another way to look at Europe's history in a nutshell, is it's king of the hill writ large. It's chopped up into all these different kingdoms.
The miracle of Charles Martel.
Yes, Charles Martel plays a critical role, but that's going beyond what I wanted to say today. What I wanted to say today is just Europe was divided against itself constantly. So if Constantinople had not held back the Islam during the Great Expansion, we might all be Muslims now. That's just a fact, because they were very good at what they did and we were very bad at what we did. We lucked out by having this wonder of the world sitting there right at the crossing, right, left over from the ancient epoch that was better than anything we were doing at the time. I say lucked out. Maybe we'd be better under Islam. I don't know. But the point is that the Crusades were supposed to be a pure expression of the medieval plan. The medieval plan was spreading in a totalitarian fashion the pure, perfect message of God's goodness across the entire world, eliminating all heresy, and uniting the world as a brotherhood under God. That was supposed to be the plan. And the Crusades were, let's go back to the Holy Land and drive out the other religion, right? This is like medievalism in a nutshell. It's like we've succeeded enough that we've ostensibly converted Europe itself to Christianity. The next step in the medieval program is to spread beyond Europe and convert the Middle East, right? North Africa, the steppes, everything should become Christian. So everything's riding on the Crusades. The whole belief system of the medieval epoch is depending upon, this perfect expression of, now that we're united, we can carry God's message before us in battle. So to have that be diverted and turn into sacking one of the greatest Christian strongholds of Europe was, I can't begin to say what a shock that was across Europe. It was just horrifying. It was long before the corruption of Leo X and all these other, late popes. It was like the way it's hard for us to understand the generation after World War I who came home and all of the belief in progress and modernism that preceded the war had been driven out of them.
The Seventh Seal.
Say it again?
The Seventh Seal, the movie where the Crusader's returning home after his visions and dreams and beliefs have been shattered.
Yes.
Playing the chess with death.
Yes. That same level of world-weary burnout and despair and the collapse of a worldview and collapse of dreams was associated with that. It would be hit even harder later with the Children's Crusade, when the children, motivated by Jesus' example, unite. They march off to the Holy Land, where they are captured by Christians and sold off into slavery. Christians selling their own children for money was just really the icing on the terrible cake that was the sacking of Constantinople.
Well, the Ottomans were hugely powerful.
They were. Well, and this is what I'm setting up here.
Technically advanced, and they were knocking at the door. They were sending little letters to people like the Pope, surrender now while the going's good. The last thing they need is a Pico stirring up trouble in the auditorium.
Yes.
This is a place where the adults are, Pico.
Yes.
We've got some serious business at hand.
Yes. and this is the underscore I want to put under what you posted, that ever since 1198, Constantinople was tottering along, but it was not anything like what it had been, and everybody knew it. And so it was not surprising, but nevertheless still devastating when in 1453 the Turks took it. It fell. There goes the gateway to Europe. And remember, with Pico, you know, what era are we talking about here? We're talking about, you know, Pico dies in 1494, right? So this is within the lifetime of people there. They are seeing the fall of one of the great bastions of Christianity. They are seeing the rise, the triumph of the Ottoman Empire. And as Stephen is emphasizing, the popes saw that more clearly than the visionaries did. They were focused on, if we are going to survive this, we cannot afford to be rocking the boat right now. We have got to unite and get our stuff together so that we can deal with this problem. This is the most important thing. If we don't deal with this, nothing else will matter. And this, by the way, part of the reason I really wanted to underscore this, and I'm so glad Stephen brought it up, is this helps to underscore the reason why the attempt to have God run the world by having his agents become also political agents and get involved in political things, why it cannot do anything other than lead to corruption. It's not because politics corrupts. It's not because politics is bad. It's because if you are in charge politically, it means you are going to face the most important problems of your time. Sometimes don't have very important problems, but other times have world-changing problems. The problems that it's now or never, do or die. And when people are put under those kinds of stresses, it is very rare for them to make the right choice. It's just too hard. You're just under too much pressure. And so as Stephen is emphasizing, during the time when Pico is writing, when Savonarola is conducting his bonfires of the Vatican, there are very few times more stressful in the last 1,000 years than that time. They are really scared about what's going to happen.
If you read, and you know the stuff, the Ottomans were a very, very powerful force, very sophisticated, very advanced, yes, very well organized, huge, wealthy, powerful.
Yeah, take it away, Stephen.
If you knew what you were up against, you're probably saying your prayers and thinking, I hope God's got something good for me after this, because we're not going to survive. We're doomed.
Right.
We're going to have to really pull the coal out of the fire on this one.
Right.
I mean, the Ottomans took up the gunpowder at a vastly superior rate than the Europeans did. They'd rearmed in a very short order. Now, think too, it was only 3.5 centuries ago, the Ottomans were knocking at the gates of Vienna. Only 3.5 centuries ago, they were the big fear. They were still the big danger.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, if you guys have never read about the fall of Constantinople, you really should. It's like in the dozen moments of the medieval epoch that it's the most important to know is that moment, because it is in some ways the embodiment of the dialectical principle that one epoch grows out of the previous one, and things that, that there are survivals of the old epoch that help to define the new epoch. And Constantinople sitting where it did, when it did, as this bastion of classical and ancient knowledge, was one of those things that's just like reifies, it makes tangible this idea of the interpenetration of these epochs. And so the fall of Constantinople had a certain kind of finality to it that the medievals never thought would happen. It was like the foundations of the world being pulled out from under you. Something you would have, before that, before the sacking of Constantinople by the Crusaders, they would have thought Constantinople was impregnable. It was the perfect city. You couldn't do better than that. And other cities elsewhere aspired to that level of greatness, and they didn't think that they'd got there. They thought someday, maybe in the distant future, if people work at this, they could rise to the level of Constantinople. So if it can fall to the Ottomans, what they're thinking is everything else we've got is of an inferior quality. Nothing else we have could stand up to that. One of the things that Stephen's talking about is the great cannons, right? The gunpowder cannons that the Ottomans were using. They found a way to take down those walls. And in some ways, that is, again, sort of a perfect example of the victory of empiricism over rationality. Even though nobody at the time would appreciated it or understood it, they were using science to combat what had been created through reason.
Technology.
They're using technology. And the technology...
beware conflating science with technology.
You're absolutely right. But they were using technology that came out of their scientific tradition. Right? Some of these, Avicenna and Al-Biruni, some of these people that we talk about who are chemists, and they're studying optics, they're studying all kinds of things, and they're running experiments, and through the process of experimentation, they're winnowing out enormous numbers of intuitive but false ideas from the ancient world, and they're being left with a stronger and stronger core of empirically useful ideas that can be turned into technology. And getting better and better gunpowder, better and better metallurgy, able to withstand a gunpowder explosion and direct it. All of this stuff is working together now for the Turks to allow them to do what they do. So, and as with, we talked last week about the way that, coming out of the Crusades, Europe was a little bit demoralized to discover that they were a backwater and comparatively ignorant, that the Islamic people knew so much more than they did. And they set up the university system, right? Imitating the houses of wisdom of the Muslim world. They start creating this kind of university system in Europe, trying to raise their game so that they can compete with them. So
hang on, the university system might have flourished at the time, but it was something which had existed since the fall of the the Western Empire anyway.
Well, there were predecessors. I'm not saying it came from nothing.
The definition of the liberal arts came from the period when the Western Empire fell.
Yeah, right.
That was the lifeboat of thought and reason they thought would continue through the Middle Ages. To say that the European university system was purely a copy of somewhere else.
No, it was a hybrid. You're right. It was a hybrid.
I'd say on the other hand, be careful with the idea between science and technology. This is the thing.
You're right.
You're a scientist, you have a tradition which stretches back through the ages, and you respect, and there's even a spirituality there, how the understanding came about, how it all came to be. That's part of science. But the Ottoman emperor, or whoever, what power magnate you ever have, is only interested in the results, only interested in, give me the big cannon, man. I couldn't hang the science. I couldn't give a damn. The philosophy, the science, just give me the power.
Right.
I can't remember who it was. I think it was a French 19th century philosopher who warned there is always a great, great danger here. And he said that what we're seeing now in the Western world, and also the interest that's coming from the Eastern world in Western technology, they're seeing this, and they're thinking like the Japanese are seeing all this Western technology. Wow, this is amazing stuff. And he was warning, do not forget the tradition which led to this, because people will only want the object. They'll only want the machine, and not understand how it came into being in the first place. And he said, this will be incredibly dangerous when the understanding of philosophy, the history of it. Oh, well, I don't need that. I just need the powerful machine that's the result.
Right.
He said this will be tragic.
You're right. It's the goose and the golden egg. It's so tempting to put the value on the golden egg and to forget about the goose that makes it possible. That's how it is with science and technology.
Let's just kill and eat the goose for dinner.
Right?
We'll
Why not?
We'll have the golden eggs.
Or as it says in the story, why should I be so impatient? Why do I have to wait every day for one golden egg? Why don't I cut the goose open and get all the eggs out now? And then, of course, it turns out there aren't any in there because it was the goose that made the eggs. Yes.
What I was going to say was I've been looking up that whole era of Christian transition in the Constantine era.
Yes.
And yeah, I forgot, but one of the descriptions you keep on coming across with these new Christian emperors was that paganism was just a whole load of idiot superstition.
Right.
And the Christian emperors are saying, well, this is the whole thing, that the Christians are saying that our religious philosophy is reasonable. And they had an argument. And your pagan nonsense is just superstition and foolery.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could I just backtrack just a second? Rick, I'm sorry. I'm interested in this golden egg business. They opened it up and there were no eggs because why?
Well, you know the story of the goose and the golden egg?
I guess not. But I just wanted to hear the part where you said when they opened it up, there were no eggs.
So you know, the birds make eggs. They're not containers full of eggs.
Okay.
Each egg is made by the bird at the time that it's gestating.
Okay. Oh, that's what you meant by it. Okay.
Yeah, and so someone who values the golden egg and doesn't value the goose can't understand that. They can't understand that the thing that they value is merely a product of the thing that they aren't valuing. And as a result, they will tend to misinterpret the thing they don't value as being as little as they can make it. And the little they can make it is maybe it's a container. Maybe the goose is just hollow and it's full of golden eggs. And for some reason it's withholding them and only giving one a day. And that's mean of it.
And they don't understand that the egg is made one at a time.
Yeah, it doesn't understand that.
Okay.
Right.
Well, in your American tradition, this is the position of the liberals when they want infinite welfare. And they look at that jar of cookies the government seems to have. Why aren't they giving us all the cookies? Let's raid the cookie jar and eat all the cookies. And that's modern liberalism today. That's its economic theory.
I find both political parties in the United States are equally bad with the goose and the golden egg. I don't think
fair enough.
the U.S. has any wise political parties who really get this idea that you're talking about. The idea you're talking about is the thing that I wish they would all get, which is you got to understand where the good things come from. It requires the culture of science, the culture of the things that we do that allow us to make the discoveries. And without that, and without the investment in that culture, we're not going to get the cool bombs that the generals want to drop somewhere. Or we're not going to get the clean water or any of the other goods that people want. They have to invest. And so it's like you're saying, you're right. People can wield technology without understanding the science. And there's usually in these power structures a massive difference between in social station between the people who are quietly working away in their labs, making discoveries and writing them down and sharing them on the one hand, and then the people who take the gunpowder or the metallurgy that results from that and deploying it.
Well, as Moorcock asked, who was with Elric, who was master, sword or swordsman?
Exactly. Yes.
If you do not understand the power you're using, you can become its victim.
Yeah. There's some. I did some work. The period that I look at the most in history is right around 1000 in the British Isles because of my gaming group. I've got a couple bookcases full of works on Anglo-Saxon England, and one of the things I spent a bunch of time looking at was the predecessors for the university system in Europe. And you're right that there are predecessors, and they can't be discounted. They're important. They had canons of colleges of secular monks, they called them. And they were places where they functioned like a monastery, but they were allowed to preserve works other than strictly devotional works. They were allowed to do works on herbalism or on mining, stonemasonry, farming, things like that. And they were seen as an adjunct to the primary monastic system. And they would sort of help the farmers be better farmers and help the miners be better miners. And along the way, these colleges would sometimes preserve like an Edda, or they would preserve, Aristotle's rhetoric or things like that. But they had to be careful about not doing it too openly or they would get suppressed. There were a number of clampdowns from the Roman Church at various points where they would discover that the canon of secular colleges was a little not focused enough on God and a little too focused on science or culture. And they'd come in and, clear the place out and start over again and tell them all they all have to be Benedictines for the next 50 years and maybe to let them study some more. So it's important, you're right, to recognize that there were predecessors to the university system, but you have to also be clear that they were pretty weak, benighted places. What they did was important, but it was not celebrated the way the later universities would be. It didn't have the level of support. Much of the important work that they did in those secular colleges was quiet and underground, and that was the only way they were allowed to do it.
Getting back to what I was trying to point out about this era, I was surprised and had forgotten about it. But yes, the Christians, which overturned the pagans, regarded the pagans as superstitious fools.
Right.
But of course, we come to an age today where the new atheists regard the Christians as a load of fools. Okay, let's come to the creation of the universe. The Christians say that there was this all-powerful entity that said, "Let there be light," so on. But we're a lot cleverer today. We're atheists. We say that the whole universe came out of an infinitely small amount of space, which expanded into this sort of imbalanced, sort of chaotic universe. And I'm thinking, really, that sounds maybe even more crazy than the one that the Christians came up with, the idea of a big bang, which, who was it, Hoyle laughed his head off. This is just ridiculous. It, right?
That was Hoyle who named it. Yeah. Well, it's worth underscoring the point you made right before that, which is, again, because of the dialectical nature of history, there are deep ironies built into the process of transformation of cultures. And to go from Augustine's era, where the Christians considered the pagans to be superstitious fools, all the way to the modern epoch, where moderns consider Christians to be superstitious fools. It is a complete, again, it's exactly the same kind of complete 100% reversal that we see with the change from a totalitarian medieval church to an ecumenical modern church. That kind of flipping, not just to be different, but to be 180 degrees inverted. This is what Hegel talks about when he talks about the negation and the negation of the negation. He says, the thing about the dialectic that is counterintuitive, but that holds up over and over in study after study, that's hard to really fully absorb, is how often things become their opposite. Not just something different, but their complete opposite. And you can't, at some point, you have to stop calling it a coincidence and say it must be a feature of the laws of organic developments, this kind of flipping that happens over and over in the processes of history and in people's lives. The dialectic involves these kinds of inversions. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Stephen. Phil, you got your hand up, and then we'll go back to the history here and wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring back Hegel, because I see that flipping is quite often, how should I say, surreptitious. Because like history had these moments in which things turn. For instance, I was always surprised how late the Eastern Roman Empire lasted. Yeah. I think it was until 1468 or 1486, very late. Okay, so that's 900 years after the fall of the Western Empire.
Yeah, okay? Right.
Number one, and number two, it was an accident of history in a sense, because the Muslims, probably through Genghis Khan, have imported in a way gunpowder from China, that China had developed it uh, for fireworks, and then later on limited military use. But they really developed it, I think, partly in India or somewhere near there, but certainly. So it was really finally made into the canon that destroy, Byzantium, because the walls were not able to hold back cannon fire. So that was history. And it also seems like because the Ottomans, in a sense, was so dominant in that part of the area, it really blocked the trade through the Silk Roads.
Yeah.
And which means that they had to find another road. Now, Italy, and particularly Venice, was very, very important, because Venice at that time, before the fall of Byzantium, Venice was trying very hard to help Byzantium from keeping it from falling. So that was very important. But after it was blocked, it was really that which opened up a necessity to look for a new route, both by the Portuguese around Africa, and then by the Spanish, across the oceans. Well, first of all, they got to the Far East, that developed the trade and all that, and then it was like Columbus, who ran into the new Indies, the West Indies, and discovered a new continent that changed the whole dynamic. And then it was once again an accident of technology, both the canon and the printing press accident, because it was able to transform the Roman letter, because it was an alphabetic letter of, well, not even 26, but 26, it developed into 26 letters, that it was easy to make a mechanical device. Well, not easy, but relatively easy. Whereas the Arabic language was so complicated in terms of the minutiae of the handwriting and everything, it was very difficult to turn it into a printing process, because there's so many subtle differences that it couldn't produce mass numbers of things that actually inspired, in a sense, the conceptual revolution versus that eventually turned into the Industrial Revolution. So that was an accident in a way, because the Ottomans had conquered Byzantium. If they haven't, they would have continued going the Silk Road. They might not have invented the printing press. All these little incidences that is not planned. Oh, look what we discover. And it just so happens we discovered the printing press that could translate into a mass production of information, dissemination, whereas the Arabics, they still have to write, and that different sections have different dialects, so they have to transform those. It's like, it was complex. I don't know how late the Middle East began to actually incorporate the printing press. It was much later. So they had a jump start because of an accident of history that has nothing to do with anybody's plans. It's certainly the Ottomans didn't say, let's conquer them so that they have to find another route. So they have to invent the printing press so we can't keep up with the transfer of information.
Nobody could have planned this.
That's right. It just happens. And then what happened is that it transforms it, and you don't even know what the future was, but it did completely flip the dynamics, which was all in the Islamic.
Okay, hang on a second there. Rudolf Steiner says the devil planned it all.
Well, maybe. Yeah, if you want to blame the West for being the devil, but nonetheless, it's just sort of like that sort of accident. It really was a kind of like I guess a transformation of, let's say, religious power versus a kind of like a kind of information power, because it was information that actually transformed the Europeans, because who was very, very backwards, into suddenly into like advancing new knowledge and new understanding that created a base for more industry, more technology that transformed into the 19th century Industrial Revolution. So this was, none of it was like, oh, I planned it. I mean, so So we have to listen to the many things happen just by circumstance. You know, nobody was smart enough to plan it out, but some people were smart enough to at least take advantage of tactical advantage of that particular moment, and that helped transform the world.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing the number of different places in history where something like that ended up changing the whole direction. Somebody took advantage of something and suddenly they rose to power, and nobody could have foreseen it. There is a contingency to the course of human life and human history that is just shocking sometimes, just shocking how it foils the grand designs of historians and historical planners who say, I have divined the forces of history and I will now tell you how history works, and this will allow you to predict the future and make things come out the way you want. You know, there's this kind of when Kenneth talks about the difference between existentialist and escapist philosophies, history is one of the clearest places to see that.
So well, if Islam have understood that this was going to all happen, they would say, "Oh, just come through the Silk Road. We'll help you."
Right.
I mean, like, they're not going to let that happen. It's like, it's just purely they did something, they thought it was right, and it turns out it was wrong.
Yeah, real history lacks tidiness, but it has a profundity in which, you know, buried strands of history erupt. And afterwards we look back and go, wow, that was there simmering the whole time, waiting to come out. But in advance, like everybody else, we've forgotten about the buried strands, and so we can't see the eruption coming. When we try to, you know, predict, we end up with a tidy picture of the future that leaves out these kind of deeper, you know, principles waiting to unfold in front of us. So Savonarola, let's bring it home with Savonarola. So how to explain all of this? What a mess this history is. I'm going to put a link to the war, the Italian War of 1494 to 1495, because you can't understand this stuff without knowing about the war. A number of popes get tangled up around the plans of King Charles of France. And remember that France has the University of Paris, which is the leading university of the time. And that's where Pico was educated and where he met a lot of people that would later be so important in his life. So there is a connection between his home. You know, he and other people represent a connection between France and Italy. And, you know, for 1,000 years, all of these monarchs have been inbreeding. So they're all related to each other and they all have claims on each other's lands. And so they've got this intricate system for deciding whose claim is the best. And that's how they try to keep the peace. It's okay that you're king because you're actually the son of King so-and-so and I'm only the cousin. And therefore you have the stronger claim. But every time in the medieval history, you end up with no clear successor, but a number of possible successors. You know, so-and-so's cousin, so-and-so married in, so-and-so, and those are the only people who are there. Those tended to be the fiercest, most vicious wars in the medieval epoch where Europeans fought each other. And this is one of those. And it's exacerbated by the fact that you've got popes looking at Constantinople and panicking and wanting to adjust the political landscape in Italy and Europe to try to create a stronger alliance to stop squabbling amongst each other and focus on the Ottomans, right? One of these popes in this period, that's his whole thing. Just like Stephen says, the Ottomans are on their mind. They're thinking about, what do I have to do in order to ensure that Islam doesn't come rushing in from the east and take us all while we're busy squabbling? So they start meddling in dynastic intrigue and egging on this king or that king to get involved in this or that. And one of the ways that they do that is to emphasize that, you know, King Charles ought to get involved in Italy, that he's got a legitimate concern, he ought to come get involved. And so when the time is right, he comes south. And this causes panic among a number of the lords. And in the meantime, there's papal succession. So you end up with a different pope in charge who didn't initiate, who wasn't the one who egged on Charles, and is now going, oh crap, at a time when we ought to be looking at the Ottomans, where now we've got a war between France and Italy, and tries to put together a league of people to resist the invasion, right? At the same time that's going on one side, you've got Savonarola on the other, who's criticizing the church for its corruption, and he's going to he's pulling out the Old Testament language. He's talking about how God's going to descend from on high, and soon a sword is dangling over Italy for its corruption, and soon it's going to see what comes. There'll be an agent of the Lord will cross the mountains and bring justice. So you better get right with the Lord now. He's preaching this stuff, and people are panicky for any number of reasons, and he starts building a real following around this. And he's leavening this discussion with, criticizing the corruption, which everybody can see, and they all agree that's horrible. He's with the way that the excesses of wealth are leading people to mistreat the poor, and everybody can see that, and that's causing a huge movement among the poor, but also among, basically decent people. You can't not listen to that. When Savonarola is pointing it out and speaking openly about it, it's like, well, yeah, you're right. This is hideous. This has to change. And so he's building this big movement, and they like his fire and brimstone preaching that's centered in the one hand on the teachings of Jesus, and on the other hand on the apocalypse of John and the end times, and on the third hand on what's wrong in the world today and who's corrupt and so forth. And so he's creating a melange of these things, and that melange is getting him. The issue comes down with Charles coming down from the north, because now the question is, yes, the Pope and some other city-states would like us to ally with them against Charles, but I'm criticizing them for their corruption, and I say that somebody's going to come down and clean the place out, and here comes Charles. So maybe I could convince King Charles to be God's agent on earth and to root out corruption and help restore the church. So he declines to join the league against the invader. And Charles is militarily powerful and highly successful, and pretty soon he's at the gates of the city. And Savonarola goes out with a delegation of other people to talk to him, to try to. The people in the city are panicky. They're expecting, raping and looting and, destruction of the city. And Savonarola goes out there and says, "Congratulations, I forecasted your coming. I prophesied it. Look, here's where I wrote it down. All these people already heard me prophesy it. You're the agent of the Lord, come from the north. And you don't need to unleash your soldiers upon the city. We're already with you. We just want you to help us clean up the church and root out corruption in among the nobility." And Charles is like, well, that's cool, right? I mean, put yourself in Charles's position. He's a medieval king, so he already thinks he's got the divine mandate on the one hand, but on the other hand, he's no priest. He's heavily involved in secular maneuvering and trying to maintain power, and he's in the middle of doing that right now. And here comes someone along that says, your secular maneuverings are not a digression from your mandate from God. They are the evidence of God, that you're following God's plan. It's not just in general that you have divine right, but literally in the movements that you're taking right now, God's smiling upon you. And I, his prophet, and have been telling everyone you're coming. And that's why you don't even have to fight this city. We're already with you. So for Charles, this is like, this is that medieval recipe. This is that thing ringing true. You try this with a modern CEO, and unless he's a throwback, he's going to laugh at you. But you try this with a genuinely medieval king, and if you're authentic, there's bells ringing in his head. You are appealing to the old dream of secular authority being, God's will on earth. And it's irresistible. He can't not believe it. So he spares Savonarola city and drives out the Medicis. And Savonarola and his council are now in charge of the city-state. And they go about setting up reforms to treat the poor better and to root out corruption. They become a self-governing city-state. A brotherhood of man at the level of the city-state, awaiting the end times for when, God is going to end all of this and we'll go on to the kingdom of heaven. In other words, it seems like everything he prophesied came true so far. Now, what do you suppose that does to a Homo sapiens? To have all of history's events arrange themselves so that they seem to be proving you right. That maybe, if Savonarola had doubts about whether or not he was seeing visions from God, it would be pretty hard to keep those doubts after Charles came in and said, cool, you're right, let's not sack it. I'm with you. You are God's agent. This is heady stuff. As an animal, we did not evolve to be able to cope with this sort of thing very well. So Savonarola does what anybody does in this position, which is he starts to up his game. This is only the beginning of what's coming. All of Italy will be purified. Charles is God's agent on earth. I'm God's prophet, and I'm telling you, the end times are nigh. The corrupt papacy is in for it. And all you nobles in the South, you're going to get what's coming to you. And he basically unites everybody against him except Charles. Now they all hate him, right? Because the humility and caution that he had earlier when his life was immediately in danger has now been lifted off his back. And so he inflates. And so he makes bigger and bigger prophecies. And the Pope finally has it with him. And all these reforms that he's doing in the city, all these things that he's improving are going side by side with pissing off all the powers that be, and also destroying culture, right? They're burning paintings left and right. They're burning books. It's like they're all mixed together, the good and the bad, in this inextricable combination. And it means that people who would have backed him and that could have allowed him to spread his program more widely are instead against it. The exact same person, the exact same charisma, the exact same motivation that is leading to his successes is also leading to his eventual defeat. Right? Again, dialectics. So Pope Alexander VI, who's leading the league against Charles, is so angry at Florence for siding with Savonarola and Charles against the league that they excommunicate. He excommunicates Savonarola, and he threatens to interdict the whole city-state if they keep harboring him. So Savonarola describes the church as a whore. He uses the whore of Babylon language. He pulls out all the stops from Revelation in the Old Testament, and that has the predictable effect. So finally, under the stress of the excommunication for heresy and sedition, he withdraws from public preaching. He's told by the Pope to stop. Just if he ever wants to come out from under excommunication, he has to knock it off, stop publicly preaching. And he does for a while, and instead he writes. And so the writings we have from Savonarola come from this period, because he backs off and writes stuff down. But what happens when he's no longer out there charismatically guiding the city? Well, what would you think would happen? There's a power vacuum. Other people start to rise. People start to forget about Savonarola. He starts to fade from the central position in Florentine consciousness, and he can see it happening right before his eyes, and he finally can't do it. So he starts preaching again. He comes back out and starts to hint that they shouldn't be looking away because his is a divine mission. He might even be able to perform miracles. You should come back and listen to him again because he's got all this exciting stuff, and that leads to a showdown, which leads to a trial by fire. First trial by fire in over 400 years in Florence. He and his competitor are both gonna walk on hot coals and go see who God favors. And all of Florence is like, wow, is it true? Do we have God's agent with us on earth? And we looked away, and we should have been focusing on him the whole time. So they all show up. Everybody's there to see Savonarola walk through the fire unharmed, which they think is going to happen. but instead it rains and puts out the fire and the coals, and everyone is disgusted with the whole thing. Savonarola comes out of it looking even worse because he didn't predict that. He thought, he said, God is going to vindicate me, and nothing of the sort happened. And so even more people are getting angrier that he's not only losing the papacy and the nobles, he's now losing the people. There's a riot. They assault the convent where he's staying, and he and two others end up being arrested and imprisoned. And that's when he goes through his Joan of Arc period, where, first he confesses that he invented the prophecies and visions, and then he recants and says, no, I didn't invent them. I really did pass on God's word. And he goes back and forth a few times, and in the end, he's hanged and burned. So the thing that's hard to remember about stories like this is that the real story is so much messier than a cartoon version of it would be. If you were trying to, weeks from now or months from now, if you didn't think about Savonarola and then you tried to remember his life, you could remember the reforms and the preaching and the prophecies. But it's a little hard to remember all of the embarrassing things that happen along the way, the things that are screwed up just as dramatically as the things that are got right, that are all knotted up together in one big mix. It's hard to keep track of all of that.
Well, he got tested against reality. It's wonderful to shoot your mouth off about a great load of ideas, and then the actual reality test comes up.
Yes. I mean, in a nutshell, the problem is that the spirit of medievalism is anti-empirical, right? The spirit of medievalism is, we will take the faith that arose in Palestine and we will marry it to propositional logic. And that will be the basis for our decision making. And we don't need anything else. That, where the Islamic world had grudgingly given space to empirical investigation and science, which led to the Ottoman Empire with their amazing cannons and guns, Europe didn't want to give empiricism that kind of space. It didn't make sense. It wasn't part of the core promise of European medievalism. They didn't think that God would require that sort of thing of us. They thought they already had a pure, perfect gospel that would tell them what God's plan was, and that it would be infallible. And they thought that they had God's agents on earth who, although they were human beings, they would be filled with the Spirit and give us unadulterated, the correct picture of what God wanted from us. They thought that the problems of empiricism for them didn't exist, that they lucked out by God's plan in having direct access to the real truth. And that was their Achilles heel over and over and over. You see these people rise in the medieval era time and time again, who come armed with brilliant ideas and an amazing passionate faith and creativity, but because they lack empiricism, they're not winnowing their ideas and separating out the chaff of false but convincing things in order to find the hard core of things where the truth intersects with reason and with faith. And as a result, there keep being these embarrassing, humiliating moments right at peak moments in medieval history. There keep being these flops where, for want of just a little empiricism, it could have been a grand victory, right? Savonarola created his own enemies, but he didn't have to. He could easily have preached that differently and spread a movement that went across all of Europe for reformation, for the treatment of the poor, and for cleaning up the church. But because he was so quick to make enemies, because he was so sure of himself, and he was so sure that God had his back, that he was accurately prophesying, and that therefore God would protect him, it set him up for failure.
If he had been persistent and gentle, never know.
Yes, right? Exactly. He could have had the Medicis working with him and for him instead of against him. And the same is true of all of the other noble houses. But he went about it in a way that was guaranteeing to create enemies as quickly as possible.
Right was on his side.
But God's on his side, right? That's the thing. The challenge of medievalism is that without the basis in empiricism, I don't know quite how to put it. The wind is never quite in your sails, I guess, is what I want to say. You never consistently, you're not able to persist over the long haul. Your first crusade might be an astonishing victory, but by the fourth crusade, it's turning into a farce. And pretty soon, you're sending crusades into the south of France to wipe out Christian heretics. I mean, it's like the lack of stability that we talked about earlier goes hand in hand with the lack of empiricism. And in all of this, we can see what happens when truth-seeking is not valued as highly as believing that one has the truth already. When you talk about it, this is an example of where virtues are hard to communicate to people because they're so easy to reinterpret as whatever somebody's worldview already wants to allow. So someone can call the truth the dogma that they possess, but that they've never tested, and say, I'm the most truthful person there is because I cling to, quote, the truth. And another person could say, you know, my head may be full of nonsense, but I always tell you candidly what's in it. And therefore that makes me truthful, even though 90% of what I say is false. And both of these people can believe in their heart of hearts that they're exemplifying the virtue of truthfulness without ever seeing the problem that the truth isn't what's in here, it's what's out here. That they're not ever putting these things to the test, that they're not winnowing. Aristotle talks about the great hazard of virtues being that if you've only got one of them and you don't have the others, the ones you miss poison the one that you have until the one that you have becomes a vice. Savonarola's very charisma got him killed. If he was less effective and more obscure, no, he would never have been excommunicated. It was because he presented a clear and present danger to the Pope that he had to be excommunicated. His virtue became his undoing. And likewise, the certainty was what drove his charisma, that he knew he was not a hypocrite. He knew he was speaking from his heart. When he gave a presentation, he spoke with the full force of his conviction and beliefs and personality. And that's, for an audience, that's incredibly moving. I mean, you can tell when you're listening to someone who's got canned speeches and canned talking points and pivots back to what they prepared for to avoid your question. You can tell the difference between that and somebody who speaks from their heart and tells you what they honestly, deeply believe, you know, to the bottom of their soul. These people can move people, but the very conviction in the medieval sense, medieval conviction goes hand in hand with not ever testing it, with being sure you couldn't possibly be wrong. So there is an irony. And the irony is you can be as committed as it's possible to be committed to being a humble person who is a servant of God. And yet, through the power of that faith, do it in a way that is so certain of itself that it becomes the opposite of humility. Without you ever having self-aggrandized on purpose. Your whole purpose can have been the opposite of self-aggrandizement, and you could still end up living a life in which you make the same choices that somebody would have made who was self-aggrandizing. The horrible irony of virtues when they get perverted by vices is the way that they can become their opposite. So Savonarola. So you know, the whole story of Savonarola, like the whole story of Pico, is complicated. It's very human. It's a product of its times. This need for God in a different way than a modern needs God, right? They didn't have evolution. They didn't have the cell theory of biology. They didn't have the germ theory of disease. They didn't know why most of the things that happened to them, the big things in life, happened. They needed God, not only as God, but as the explanation of all these other things. There was a level of profound attachment and centering around God that we can't imagine because we've made room for additional things. You know, to us, God doesn't have to be directly involved in every moment at every place in the universe to keep things going. It's not a series of infinite miracles that anything at all goes right. We understand that nature has arranged itself over a very long period of time so that things not always, but often go in a more or less right direction, whether we intervene or not. And we can imagine a version of God who could create a universe like that, that doesn't require himself to be constantly rescuing everybody and everything from collapse. He can make a universe that makes sense and holds itself together. An organismic God, a nature-based God. Not really in the ancient sense, but in a more naturalistic sense than the medievals were capable of. So what it means is that faith in the medieval epoch had a way of erupting at a level of passion that it almost never does in the modern epoch, because all their eggs were in one basket. It was the pure, perfect form of monotheism, in the sense that they believed nothing else could save them and nothing else had meaning, only this one thing. And therefore they needed it all the time, everywhere, at full intensity in order for things to work out. In an environment like that, you know, under stress, you're going to get a Joan of Arc, you're going to get a Savonarola, you're going to get a Pico, you're going to get countless visionaries, Hildegard von Bingen. You're going to get people popping up all over the place whose full unconsciousness, whose full creativity is fused into the theology and erupts with visions and possibilities that can change history. So there's a reason why, even though Savonarola failed, Martin Luther looks back to him. Martin Luther succeeds where Savonarola fails, but he doesn't succeed by himself, ex nihilo. He succeeds with the shockwave that Savonarola has already begun. Because for a short time, Naples was governed without a king and without the blessing of the Pope. And they did okay. And the poor were treated okay, right? It was possible that the divine right of kings was not necessary to do governance on earth. He proved it for a couple of years. And that haunted Europe for a long time to come. Phil, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, but because he was a warrior of God, he's with God now in heaven. So, I mean, in some sense, you can't really disprove him. To me, it's really a manifestation of the story of Abraham, right?
Yes.
I am commanding you to kill your beloved son, right? You may have had doubts. And he was only saved by that the last moment when God says, "Oh, just kidding."
Right.
You don't have to kill him after all. I thought that was kind of a practical joke. I mean, like God saying, "Just kidding. You don't have to do it after all." I mean, it's just testing you. I mean, so in some sense, you could say he won in some sense. I mean, at least in his mind, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not in the world, because he proved that he was a warrior of God.
Right. Right.
Now,
No,
I'm not in that position. I'm not with him, but I'm just sort of showing, like, yeah.
I understand. You know, and this also really underscores the difference between medieval faith, modern faith, and ancient faith, right? Because despite all that passion, despite pouring everything he had into his faith, still under torture, he could confess that he made it up, but then recant, but then confess again. And what that shows is a level of instability at the bedrock of his faith. And Aquinas writes about that instability, and Augustine writes about that instability. Most of the great theological Christian writers talk about that problem in Christian faith, that there is faith and doubt are two sides of the same coin, and you can't have one without the other, right? They go together. And that is, we come to think of that as being intrinsic to faith, because moderns grew out of the medieval epoch and medievalism shaped our definition of theology. But if we go back to the ancient epoch, we find that it didn't work that way. You couldn't have doubt in Poseidon because anybody could put their foot in the ocean. It's right there. Poseidon wasn't some god who as a superpower controlled the ocean. Poseidon was the ocean. That's a different kind of faith. Demeter was the fertility of the land. Every spring, when the seeds of wheat came up, it was proof that Demeter is real. This isn't the kind of faith that a medieval Christian has. The kind of faith a medieval Christian has is of things unseen, not things seen. It's an inversion of the classical conception of faith. And as a result, it's subject to a kind of doubt that the classical devout couldn't experience. You simply couldn't doubt the ancient faith the way that you can doubt the medieval faith, right? It was because it was a different kind of divinity. So it was a different kind of faith. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my long-term problem with the humanists is my belief is their perspective is that human beings are somehow inherently good. And something you keep on coming across is virtually they have they're behaving much the same way as a religion, where they're preaching the paradise to come when humanist values prevail. And it doesn't matter whatever you do, at the end of the day, you've got this secret little card up here which says humanity will do good. And I have a lot of difficulty with that one there.
So Stephen, there's the opposite philosophy that I sometimes endorse, that human beings are evil. The struggle is to be good.
Oh, I think we'd even be luckier if they were evil. My position is they're actually neutral. If you got the evil can always see the light and be converted, but what do you do with the neutral?
Right. Because the evil knows it's being evil, right? Right. You know, the part of what Stephen said that I'd like to endorse is that the rise of the modern epoch contains within it, among the seeds of its, every epoch contains the seeds of its own destruction. But from a Hegelian perspective, by destruction, we mean the seeds of its own obsolescence and need to be replaced by what grows out of it. So one of the self-obsolescent qualities of modernism, no one could have foreseen at the beginning of modernism, because the beginning of modernism is associated with the university movement and the injection of science, the resurrection of science in Europe again. And what we see happening in that period is a massive concern for becoming educated, right? Mm-hmm. The belief is we have been ignorant for too long. What we need to do is study widely. We need to study, we need to be ecumenical. We need to be cosmopolitan. We need to be deeply educated. And only if we do all those things can we make the modern world work. And so anybody looking around would have thought that that was core to modernism, right? All the early moderns were associated with this movement in opposition against people who said, oh, we don't need those Greeks and Romans. We don't need those Muslims. We don't need to read widely at all. Let's just stick with what we know. That was who they were fighting against. So you never would have guessed that by the late era of modernism, you would have education being withheld as a privilege, as something you have to buy. And if you can't buy it, you don't deserve it. And widespread misinformation and ignorance, right? On the left and the right and the center and all the other places. There's just, it's become, the ahistorical nature of moderns is becoming one of our signatures, that we don't understand our own history. We don't know where we
mention another element as well, and that's a tendency in the paradise to come, the heavenly New Jerusalem.
Yes.
Involves the complete and utter destruction of the old order. And this is what is preached, that the only reason that our wonderful, pure, good world does not arise is the wicked brambles that are in the existing world.
Right.
And once we've burned all this away, that we've destroyed civilization, the flower of humanist good, which is destined to come, will rise above the destruction. And this is what's being preached. It's the old time religion just being preached in a new form. Let's burn the world, burn the world away to make way for the New Jerusalem to come. And this is Karl Marx as well. This is Karl Marx. Let's smash the old, this is the French Revolution. Let's tear everything down. And that's what's actually preventing the inherent good from blossoming, is the scaly old order.
It's a medievalism, isn't it? Right? The idea that we need to purify ourselves in order for the utopia to come, that's just a restatement of Savonarola without God.
Well, this is a point Nietzsche makes in one of his early books, is they're such purists.
Yes, yes. So, I'm glad you brought that point up, because it also underscores a way in which, at the same time that moderns think that they're so different from medievals, many of their recipes for how to make a better world are almost precisely the medieval recipes, just with one or two things moved around a little bit.
Well, for where the Soviet Union, look, I know it looks bad that we're killing millions, but the workers' paradise will make it all worthwhile.
Right. That was in fact Stalin's argument. So, but the other point that I was going to make, which you brought up, is the irony is that because we've become such an ahistorical people, our epoch has become so focused on ourselves and glorifying ourselves at the expense of understanding our place in history. It means that among the things that we fail to appreciate is why the medieval epoch happened at all. What was the problem it was trying to solve? In saying that people, without God and without nature, people are enough to figure out what we should do, we were returning to the mistakes that Augustine criticized in Rome. And in Rome, they were saying superior people, the best people, will rise to the top and they will govern us wisely. And Augustine said, but then why are you so corrupt? So there's human nature is just dying to be corrupted. We're just full of tendencies that lure us away from the right path and onto doing the wrong things. It's just really hard for Homo sapiens not to be seduced by the complicated world that we're in. And we need something to solve that problem, says Augustine and a whole generation of Christian theologians, right at the birth of the medieval era. Now, maybe we don't like their answer. Maybe we don't think it can be God, because it turns out God's agents on earth are just as corruptible as everybody else is, and that was not factored in by the medieval, theologians writing at the beginning of the epoch. But that doesn't remove the validity of their criticism of ancient Rome. Their criticism is still legit.
Well, the humanists are saying the same thing now when they're claiming the educated technocrat is above the undesirable sound. Their wisdom, give them the power, the technocrats, and we'll create a perfectly governed world which will be micromanaged to the last letter.
And that's the issue. That's what I'm trying to agree with you about. That modernism's blind spot is that the most important insight at the beginning of the medieval epoch into what went wrong in the previous epoch, if there was one lesson that we should take from the medievals, it would be, and we should certainly take more than one, but if there was only one, it should be their core criticism of the corruptibility of man. How easy it is for us to go astray, and how we need something to help us. And our answer is, nuh-uh. Really, what does modernism have other than nuh-uh? They're not corrupt, you're corrupt, right? We just point to their corruption at the end of the medieval period and say, so that invalidates everything you had to say, shut up. Talk to the hand. You were corrupt, and now everything you had to say is invalid, so we don't have to listen to you. But it doesn't work that way. The truth doesn't work that way. The critique of the early medievals, when they critiqued the ancient world, was spot on. And we have not yet risen to the level of sophistication to be able to take that critique seriously and say, well, then what is our answer to the corruption of ancient Rome? Ironically, what the US founders did is they instead modeled our government on ancient Rome. And they say so. If you read the Federalist Papers, they say over and over, well, we can't do Athens because the city-states were all fighting with each other. Let's do Rome. Rome will be our model. And in doing so, the US positioned itself to precisely recapitulate the problems that Augustine critiqued. And we did that without ever saying, and here's what we'll do differently to ensure that we don't repeat the exact same mistakes they made. It's like, there's no serious attempt to do that at the level of seriousness that Augustine and other medieval theologians took to critiquing what were they going to do about Rome's corruption. It's a fascinating issue that we could, of all the things to miss, that we could miss the most central thesis of medievalism and not even attempt to do a better job with it. We just decided, well, we'll just ignore that problem and carry blindly on. And what could possibly go wrong? 500 years later, I think we have our answers. Phil, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Well, a question to ask you right before we leave, Rick.
Yeah, I'll call on you.
While Stephen might be valid in his criticism of modernity, I myself don't see it that way. I see that I'm not neither good or evil, but in between. So
neutral.
So no, it's not neutral. It's not neutral. The potentiality of goodness means it's a personal responsibility for me to seek that, although I know that at times I fail. When you put it down to a kind of personal responsibility for virtue, then in a sense, you are leaning in a certain direction. You are not assured of anything. That's why I include myself as part of the fallen angel. I'm still struggling for that possibility. So I'm looking into the possibility, not necessarily the actuality. And I think if we can't get people in leaning in that direction and then being forgiving enough that they fail at times, as long as it's not too drastic, then we should accept that because we are not perfect. We cannot be expected to be perfect.
Right.
So the point is that you are your own, how should I say, your only driver that's steering the thing to a certain degree, and to not get so drunken in your own personality that your drunkenness leads you into drunk driving and accidentally, destroying others in that sense. So I think accepting the fact that you are part of humanity allows you to have the understanding of how things can go wrong. Right. Otherwise, all you could do is say, those guys are bad, which they are, but nonetheless, understanding why they have not prevented themselves from drunk driving.
Yeah.
Isn't that the medieval's description of spirit, Phil? Where it says here, this is what the modicum of spirit means, that he is architected to take responsibility in some measure for the terms of his existence. So it's a constant struggle to be good.
Yeah, I understand that, but to the degree that they have failed on their task, and I think that there's a group failure in some sense. For instance, in the last election, there was enough people who said the election wasn't stolen, and they were virtuous enough within limitations to protect that, means that they were at least carrying out their duty and responsibility, whereas others did not. So therefore, I think if you don't take it on as a personal responsibility and your possibilities, then you are adding to that, the malformation. The fact that it is human beings are lured by, immediate rewards.
That's correct.
And it's hard to ignore those, but you must do that at least, sufficiently to not fall into that morass.
So
the big question is this.
Let me just bring this up because I want to follow up on something that Rick said. Gina, I am very brief. You said that the God's appointees on the earth, they are subject to corruption and all the evil modalities. there was a period in my life when I thought that, I wasn't going to believe in God anymore because I looked at the people around me and how they were executing his word. And that's what you're talking about.
Right.
But my father came back to me and he said, God never said you should follow the human being. He said you should follow me. Do you know what me is? And I walked away and looked at him blank. So when I hear you say that, because all these religions, they're corrupt, every single one of them, all the Christian denominations, even Islam, Hinduism, all of them have their periods of corruption, every single one. The thing is, how much time are you going to spend studying the theology to get to the real essence of the matter?
Yeah.
My big question.
Yeah.
Shoot. Go ahead.
Yeah, my big question is, why didn't God make human beings perfect? Why not? Why didn't he make human beings perfect?
And this is the thing that medievalism discouraged, but that maybe the early Christian church before the rise of orthodoxy wouldn't have discouraged. And maybe a number of modern sects are better at this than the medieval church, which is, we don't know. The medieval church was trying too hard to make a tidy noetic bundle that was self-coherent and consistent. And they wanted to make a crystalline, perfect, irresistible system of beliefs. And the only way to do that's to lie. Because the truth is, we don't know a lot of things. There's a lot of things that are basic about human life that remain unknown to us. And as a result, the only authentic spirituality has to include a healthy dose of humility. We have to be able to say, we don't know. And if we can say we don't know, then we can deal more honestly with each other and more compassionately.
The story of Genesis.
Could I give an answer to that? I think I actually do value free will. The fact that, in a sense, I'm giving the opportunity to make the choice means that I am allowed to be virtuous. If I wasn't given that choice, I would just do what I do. That's all I do, right? And you got to live the virtuous life as best you could. So I think I do value that. That's why I actually do not like the pure determinism, which means, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do anyway. Why even bother?
Right. Yeah, I'm with you, Phil.
So just a very quick answer to Gina's question. It's not really an answer. In the book of Genesis, before Adam and Eve ate the apple, they were perfect. That's how the story goes. That's the story that's told. So you're asking the question, why didn't God make us perfect? He did. We chose not to stay perfect by eating the apple. He told us not to. That's the story. Now, there are many, many, many interpretations of that creative story. And it's been questioned many times. But that's the one that the Christian faith subscribes to.
One of my favorite variants on that story is the idea that God knew we were going to eat the apple.
Yeah.
That the purpose. Not he didn't do it out of evil, but that the purpose was that we could experience a perfect life and then go forth with free will and make choices. And that was God's plan.
Okay.
If you're going to jumpstart a race of people who could choose anything, including bad things, the only way you can do that can be justified by faith is if first you show them what it's like to make the good choices. And I always thought, and I only ran into that a few years ago, I always thought that is a very interesting interpretation, because we as part of the sort of misogynist structure of the medieval era, they were really big on blaming women and saying, well, we can punish you, we can do whatever we want because you screwed us out of paradise. But if it was always God's plan that we were supposed to leave paradise after we got a taste for it, then you didn't do anything wrong any more than Adam did anything wrong. This was all supposed to unfold this way. I thought, now that's interesting. And it's not. I reread Genesis, and you can totally see that as a possibility in there.
It's an interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah. It's
Oh,
like,
my next
the
question to you,
books are
Rick,
the
is so do you have one room completely dedicated to books from floor to ceiling full of bookshelves?
Yes, he does.
Okay, I've been meaning to ask you that for a while. I bet you do.
I have way too many books. I have way too many books. I'm not as bad as Kenneth. I can't, my house is not a maze. Most of my rooms.
Can I say one other thing, though, talking about books? So I'm
Yeah.
reading this Steven Pinker book on rationality. It's very interesting. I haven't finished it yet to have an opinion, but
You want to type that title into the chat? I can copy it and go look at it.
I was
okay.
So,
just gonna
you know,
say,
before.
I was,
Oh, I'm
I was just
sorry.
going to say that one of the problem with all revolutions, and this goes with what happened in Italy, is that the people, even if you disagree with them, the people that actually run society are practiced at what they're doing. And as soon as you eliminate them, you somehow think that you can sit in front of the controls of a 747 and fly the thing.
Don't know how to
That's
do
what
any of
happened
it.
in Cambodia. You had the
Yeah.
Khmer Rouge who came out of the jungle. The only thing they knew was they disliked those who were in power and they eliminated them. And then they suddenly discovered they didn't have a clue how to run anything.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And this explains, people think it was pure intent, evil intent, what happened in Cambodia. And I'd say a great deal of it was they panicked. They didn't have an idea how to keep the society running.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. When we eventually talk about Chinese medievalism, one of the things we're going
thank
to
you,
talk about
Joseph.
is how did China manage to hold itself coherently together over thousands of years? And one of the interesting models is the idea that they created a society so complex nobody else knew how to run it. And so whenever a foreign dynasty would come in and take over, it was not long before they had to put the Chinese back in charge of everything again. Even if it was under themselves as civil servants, it still had to be the Chinese running everything, because just like you say, Stephen, they looked around and said, I have no idea how all of this ever worked, but you guys do. So how about you run it?
Yes.
It's a thing. So
Yeah, that was interesting because, when Deng Xiaoping was running the place, he was not ahead of anything. And yet everybody knew that he was ahead of everything. It's like,
yes.
How do you figure that out?
Yes. So next week we can move on beyond Savonarola. We can wrap up the modernist section, and actually in a week or two we might be able to go on to chapter 3. But I thought it was worth taking this time because the personalities, the characters, the struggles, everything going on around the time Pico wrote, I think it helps to illuminate some of the definition between these two epochs in a way that we don't normally get in school. We don't, or in popular culture. You look at movies or books or comics or whatever, anything that talks about modernity versus medievalism, and they almost never paint a very clear picture about the relationship. Our brains are full of misunderstandings of the nature of it. So I thought seeing how embodied in one person could be at the same time such profound education and creativity, and at the same time such a conservative medieval view.
Yeah.
And that they weren't like shards the way they are with moderns. They were part and parcel of the same organic worldview.
Well, Pico noted that the human mind is a very unstable plane to fly.
Yes.
It can do wonderful things, but you have to be very good at it.
That's right.
And animals got those simple instincts, no problem.
I spent a month in Italy when I was a teenager, and my brain was a blank, basically, in terms of knowledge of Italy and Romans and all that. If I had gone there after listening to you have these, I call it lectures or discussions, my appreciation of Italy might have been quite different. It's interesting.
Well, one of the things to follow up on that, Jenny, is I've traveled quite a bit. And one of the things I appreciate about here is that and I take a lot of pictures, I do quite a bit of images, is as I hear this and I think back of the things I saw, like Maimonides. I saw his statue in the south of Spain, and he used to live there. So this discussion makes him come alive. The other thing I wanted to say is I finally understood why Kenneth Smith chose Pico to make that link between the medieval and the modern with this extensive discussion. That has elucidated this for me. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And also, Rick, I just wanted to let you know, at the beginning of this meeting today, your hair was blonde. Now it's not, it's darker. So did you color your hair while you were having this 3-hour discussion? I don't understand it, how you
The weather changing outside. I got, I've got windows here. And, well, it really changes the light.
Yeah, because you really did look very blonde when you came into the meeting, and all of a sudden your hair is darker.
You did?
Yeah, it really, yeah, I noticed things like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm,
let me
maybe
just leave you with a book recommendation. This is from Kenneth. It's a book called The Italians. It's by Luigi Barzini. Donald will have heard this one already. You know, one of the, in addition to trying to understand epochs in an organismic dialectical way, another really useful Hegelian exercise is to try to understand a single culture that way. And there are a couple of books that Kenneth recommends as kind of case studies. You might think of philosophical anthropology, where they try to, you know, understand the dialectics that make a culture what it is. And Barzini did this book called The Italians. It's short, it's very readable. And he tries to talk about these contradictions. How is this the same country, you know, that produces these amazing scholars and has this amazing history on the one hand, and then on the other it produces the mafia, you know, like fascism. It's like, how can this be the same people? And Barzini tries to draw you a portrait of Italy as a cultural organism that makes sense. We're not going to cover that in this seminar on this book, but it's really interesting reading. You might enjoy it, and it's short. It's and easy to read. So,
but I also think that what I saw as we studied Pico is that he was in Florence, which was the initiator and driver of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance led right into the Reformation, and those were two big movements, right? That heralded the modern period.
That's right. That's right. They were huge in this transition.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, with that, I guess we'll wrap up for this week, and next week we'll charge on boldly into modernism.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks a lot. It
Thank
was very good. Very,
Yes,
very good.
thank you. Thank you,
It
Rick.
was
Bye,
very-
Jenny. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Joseph.
Bye.
Oh, before I go, happy Martin Luther King Day to everybody.
Oh yeah,
Thank
happy
you.
MLK.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Happy Martin Luther
Bye,
King Day to
Sharon.
everyone.
Yes, I
Yeah,
had
bye-bye.
to mention that.